My welcome. So my role here is very simple. Just now, I'm just going to open this conference and greet you all and extend a very heartfelt welcome on behalf of the Nordic Bioethics Committee, and that includes everyone here. Very welcome, and everyone online, and also Matti, Häyry, who I think will be joining us on Zoom for the first talk. I also like to extend a great thank you for the working group that's put together this very interesting program, especially to Truls, who's been chairing this working group. He unfortunately cannot join us today. He's caught up in other matters today. The Nordic Bioethics Committee was founded in 1989 with the explicit aim of bringing together and providing room for knowledge exchange between parliamentarians, policymakers, scientists, experts, and the general public, with a special focus on matters of bioethics and ethical concerns related to biotechnology and medical things. It's currently under Nordforsk. It used to be under the Nordiska Ministerrådet, and they have been a massive help in terms of the practical arrangement of things. So a lot of our work feeds into organizing these kinds of events that is aimed to provide these kinds of room to listen to experts and hear stakeholders and policymakers and find that room for conversation. And we hope this will be the place, and this is what we will have here today as well. But of course, with 2020, something happened. We had the pandemic that not only made the whole world need to rethink a lot of things, how we work, how we teach, how we travel, and what kinds of immediate measures and long-term measures, and so also for the committee. We had planned some other meetings, but we had to move online and try out new ways to hold these kinds of events. And part of that, we organized these 5 topical webinars, each dedicated to one of the Nordic, to a speaker from one of the Nordic countries, giving some kind of ethical reflections on the pandemic. So there was a speaker from Iceland, one from Finland, one from Norway and Sweden and Denmark. But that was all in the midst of the pandemic being a very current matter, and we didn't know when it was going to end or how. Very optimistically, we thought why don't we collect all the speakers and see what lessons we learned and call it after COVID-19. Now, of course, the pandemic is not over yet. Even New Zealand, that had a very strong zero policy at the beginning, at the first wave. The Prime Minister there is caught COVID just last week. There's been talk of a 5th wave in South Africa. And North Korea seems to have a very poor situation. But with the focus of the Nordic views, we were thinking that perhaps at least past these current waves that we've experienced, perhaps there's lessons that we've learned so far. And a lot of the decisions were made when we didn't know how things were going to play out, or there were things we didn't know. So the hope is that we gain a little bit of more insight on how to think about how to respond to pandemics in the future, and perhaps there are things to learn about the differences in the different approaches in the Nordic countries as well. So we're very happy to have all the speakers with us for a final day today, and we'll also have local expert commentators from the University of Bergen here today as well as to commentate. And then tomorrow we'll bring in some policymakers and have a conversation with that, and also a conversation with stakeholders, and then a final conversation. So hopefully we'll all be a little bit wiser and know a little bit more about what lessons can be learned from this experience of the pandemic. And with that, I will hand over to Sigurður, who will moderate the first sessions, and including the first Q&A. Now, our first speaker, Matti, Häyry, will be participating online, and he will only be able to respond to questions immediately following his talk, and the other ones we'll have after the first 3 speakers. Then we'll have a short coffee break, and I'll resume and moderate and take the questions following that. And we have a slide for the whole program. Is it possible to... Yes. So we have a small coffee break, and then we'll have the remaining 2 speakers, and then a Q&A, and then we'll have Christine Bergen from Bergen and Kjetil Rommesveit also. No. And then discussion. And then we also have, we also wanted to add a bit of an informal possibility to sort of interact with speakers and exchange ideas and input in a more relaxed way, with a sort of mingling before we close, which is sort of a different format than raising hands and asking questions into the microphone. So hopefully all of that will provide some kind of meeting grounds for new ideas and insights. And with that, I leave it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madeleine. Welcome all of you. So now it's time, after this good overview of the occasion and the thoughts behind this seminar, revisiting topics that we did have a discussion about midstream, reflecting on them afterwards. We should just start doing it. And I'm going to moderate the first session here with the first 3 speakers. And as Madeleine mentioned, there will be a discussion session after all these 3 speakers. But Matti Häyry, the first speaker, will not be able to join us for that. So please, if you have questions relating to Matti Häyry's presentation, please be prepared to ask them at the end of his talk. And this applies to you, all of you here present in Bergen, but also all of you who may be following the live stream on YouTube. Whether or not you're registered or not, if you open the link and are following, you should be able to write in the Q&A YouTube format. And please don't hesitate to do that, and we will do our best to address your questions or concerns or comments. Our first speaker today is Matti Häyry. He's a professor of philosophy of management at Aalto University School of Business in Finland. He is a prolific writer and researcher and specializes in bioethics, among other things. He gave the first talk in our webinar series in October 2020. And in that talk, he posed the question whether crisis leadership could be ethics communication. And he answered that question in an interesting and memorable way. Today, he will follow up with a talk entitled Finland on Truth-Telling. So, Matti Häyry.
Hello, thank you. Good to be here, even if only as an avatar. You people in there have a good meeting, and now, technical people, if you can just roll my pre-recorded presentation, and then I'll be back after that. Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity to present in this Nordic Committee on Bioethics conference. My presentation is related to a research project that Tuija Takala and I just started at the Aalto University School of Business, with funding granted by the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland. The connection may not be obvious, but our focus is on crisis management, and from that viewpoint, comparisons between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change are quite natural. My topic today is truth-telling, so let me get straight to the point. The background of my presentation is in the ethical and philosophical question, Should we always tell the truth? A quick check with an anecdotal citizens panel produces the answer. Well, honesty is important. You will notice that the panel does not answer the question. It does not take sides on the issue of truth-telling, but directs the discussion to another topic, namely honesty. I'll come back to this later. Let's assume for now, however, that the answer is straightforward and means, yes, we should always tell the truth. We can then follow up by a question that British philosophers favored during last century. What if my elderly relative asks me about a new hat that I think is hideous? What do you think about this? The citizens panel would probably not take an absolute stand on this. A small white lie doesn't hurt. The next question comes from Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. What if a potential murderer knocks on our door and asks if we are hiding the potential victim, which we are? Kant himself thought that lying would be wrong even in this case. Social life is based on the institution of truth-telling. If lying is accepted, people cannot trust each other anymore. Collaboration becomes impossible. But Kant was left pretty much alone in his view, and we can assume that the panel would accept also this kind of lying in coercive circumstances. These would presumably be exceptions though, so the overall conclusion is that we should at least usually tell the truth. The three dots in the citizens' panel response indicate that they have learned to be cautious with the philosopher and wait for further developments. Which come in the form of my real question. Should politicians and civil servants perhaps always tell the truth? I asked a civil servant and got this. The answer is self-evident. People in public service must always be truthful in matters that pertain to their positions of trust. They cannot say anything about secret or confidential matters, but from the viewpoint of ethical sustainability, it is essential that the truth be told, meaning that they do not speak against their better judgment or give false testimony against their neighbors. Sensing that I might be asking a trick question, my informant quickly added, in reality, the knowledge that civil servants have is often imperfect, and then the truth can change when more knowledge is gained. When civil servants prepare decisions, the requirement is that all existing knowledge is taken into account. I'll return to these, but let's follow the matter at hand through first. The citizens panel could ask for a specification. What does the question even mean? Let's take a moment to clarify this. In our project, we link the question with crisis management and leadership. Talking about COVID-19, there could be somewhere, say in Sweden, an imaginary politician or civil servant called Anders T, who, to tell the truth, should say, we aim at the survival, well-being and relative freedom of contributing members of our workforce at the expense of the unvaccinated and the vulnerable, if need be. No one has said this, and no one probably will. If they did, the citizens' panel might be astonished. But if that would be telling the truth, could we demand it of Anders T and others? Objections abound. No, because what is the truth anyway? These are complicated matters. Besides, everyone knows that we can achieve better results with convenient interpretations every now and then. Health, well-being, economic flourishing, you name it. And we cannot expect that public decision makers are that self-aware in difficult matters like this. It's clearly too much to expect that Anders T, a backbencher or humble civil servant, would know that he advocates eugenic social democracy and aggregative utilitarianism, philosophical nonsense. And the entire way of thinking is flawed anyway. In democracies, citizens ought to trust their elected representatives, who carry out the will of the people. We should not pay attention to random media announcements. We should have trust in our leaders. To which the philosopher says, wow, that was a bucketful. But we are here to learn. And the first thing to learn apparently is that the question was now transformed to, can politicians and civil servants always tell the truth? If they cannot, it would seem futile to require it. Ought implies can, as the old philosophical saying goes. But why am I asking something like this? What's the point? Well, I'm asking because our project is supposed to define ethical sustainability, and according to our preliminary hypothesis, truth-telling is its pivotal element. Ethical sustainability has three main dimensions: efficiency, justice, and acceptability. Acceptability is both a descriptive and a normative category. Citizens need to comply and law and morality should be observed. But let's have a look at what efficiency means in this formula. To begin with, we need to know what is done and what the consequences are. Are we closing borders, opening restaurants, ordering isolations, vaccinating special groups for the umpteenth time? When it comes to consequences, we must first define what benefits are intended and find out what other benefits can be expected. In theory, calculating these is easy. Intended benefits times probability plus other expected benefits times probability equals total gross benefit. Then the same for costs and harms. Costs times probability plus harms times probability equals gross costs or gross harm. More about that in a minute. Assuming that everything is commensurable so far, then subtract the gross cost from the gross benefit and we have the net benefit. Then add, for good measure, a quick analysis of justice. Who benefits, who bears the costs? The result is a decision weighed by compensation. Then tell the people, these are the benefits, these are the burdens, this is how we compensate. This is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And this is how it would go in an ideal world. In the real world, there are challenges, starting with the fact that there are many other things that could have been done. Pay higher salaries to vaccination personnel, add intensive care unit places, let the pandemic run its course, increase toilet paper production. All these require similar calculations so that we can compare all possible solutions. We can name this choice of choice. Alternatives need to be known and their comparative benefits, costs and harms measured. The next challenge is to acquire the knowledge. Benefits, costs and harms can be calculated in different ways. When many ministries and agencies are involved, there is usually a research institute yes, a research institute no, and a research institute maybe. Which one do we listen to and why? We can call this conundrum epistemology. On the negative side, the point of departure is, of course, a realistic cost and risk analysis. The research institutes with their clashing views are involved in this, but there are further considerations. Especially when it comes to determining the harm, internationally recognized principles compete with straightforward risk calculations. Do no significant harm, a cornerstone of European Union's sustainable development policies, is an option. And going further into the realms of uncertainty, we can choose the precautionary principle and try to avoid the worst outcome in the worst case scenario. Who chooses and how? We can call this dimension rationality. The next step is to choose, on a more general level, who or what should benefit from our actions. Is it economy? Is it nature? Is it people? This decision reveals our value basis. And the same choice pertains to costs and harms. Should they be borne by owners, workers, or the worst of? This exposes our political morality. To top it all, the benefits, costs and harms are not always commensurable. If the government subsidizes a pop music festival, the event industry gets a boost, taxpayers' money is spent, viruses spread, and the youth is corrupted. These outcomes cannot be compared by using a calculator. There is an alternative to excessive calculations, namely trust. No need to analyze the consequences of public decisions when those affected by them have confidence in the decision makers. Someone wins, someone loses, but that's how it goes. In the big picture, authorities act in our best interest. I have my reservations about this. Trust and confidence require openness and transparency. Covering things up is, however, always a possibility, and the temptation grows stronger if we don't have to tell others what we are doing and why. This is why I would stick to the idea that public decisions are based on information that is shared with the citizens. But yes, I admit that this is quite a maze now. It's not rocket science though. Let's start once again on a clean slate and focus on the truth-telling that would be required of the authorities. Back in the ideal world, I suggested that those in power could just say, this is our decision, these are the benefits, costs and harms, this is how we compensate. With the specifications, the picture became more complicated, but the message to the people could still be clear. This is our decision. These, according to Research Institute X, are the benefits, costs and harms. They are made commensurable by criterion C, weighed by risk principle R, and compensated like this because our value basis is B and our political morality P. Values for variables X, C, R, B and P from the figure, and the decision has been communicated. Truth-telling is at its prime. For facts, the authorities are not talking against their better judgment. And if Institute X gains new information later, the decision can be changed accordingly. And the same applies to values. The authorities are being honest and transparent, and they recognize the value basis of their decisions and communicate them openly. But now we encounter the problem that started this entire mess. The imaginary decision maker Anders T was originally supposed to say about the management of the pandemic. We aim at the freedom of contributing citizens at the expense of the vulnerable. And that's a bit wild. The message does not become any softer with the specifications either. Anders T's value basis is economic and social, which is fine, but the foundation of his political morality is eugenic social democracy and straightforward aggregative utilitarianism. His motto could be, our system supports those who support the system, not those who are a burden. Can public decision makers have an obligation to say such things? Can Anders T even know what the ideological foundation of his actions is? I argue that he should. Citizens have a duty to know what the laws are and what taxes they should pay. Authorities should have a similar duty to know where they stand ideologically. I can offer courses on this if nothing else helps. Still dragging their feet, public decision makers could argue that since saying all those things would be so ugly, they cannot have an obligation to incriminate themselves. I don't know. Why would they have such an exemption? Not admissible, I would say. You may not be re-elected, but hey, that's how democracy works, right? Which leads me to my last question here. What, if anything, did I just prove with this piece of conceptual poetry? Did I prove that public decision makers always have to tell citizens even the bitter truth about the ideological underpinnings of their decisions? Maybe. If I did, we should all join in convincing our leaders and ushers that telling the truth is what they should do, even if the truth is unpalatable. Or did I prove that my reading of transparency in liberal democracies is so ridiculously literal that I should start again, now somehow more realistically? This is more likely, and in this case my team and I must find a nice funding body to finance our work so that people with more sense than I have can show me the error of my ways. So, just as a nudge nudge wink wink, we do have a bid in for Nordforsk funding by the title Resilience by Equality, where we propose to study the impact of the pandemic and similar crises on the young and the old. If you happen to be among the anonymous reviewers, help us make more sense of this with a 5-way consortium from Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Denmark and Finland. Otherwise, that's it from me for now. Let's have a great conference and thank you.
Thank you, Matti, very much for a very thought-inspiring and clear presentation with some advertisements at the end, which was very nice. Because, as I said before, Matti is present now, live through Zoom, but will not be during our question and answer session later on. So now is the opportunity, even if it skews the program a little bit, but we'll just shorten the Q&A at the end because of it, the opportunity to ask a question or comment on Matti's very interesting presentation. If you're listening to the live stream, it would be good to get a question quickly so that it will have a chance. But anyone here in the audience wants to ask a question?
May I ask a question myself?
Yeah, okay. Matti, what do you want to ask?
Well, I would ask this of me, but I have to ask it to you now. I mean, the idea of truth telling, I think that I made a convincing story there, convincing story of something, but I just don't know what. I mean, we cannot just go march to our leaders and say, Prime Minister, you now have to tell the truth, but the truth and all truth every time you open your mouth. But still, in the structure of our what we call liberal democracy, we have these principles of transparency and openness, which sort of require it. So what's going on in here?
Right. Yeah. So we have two hands that I can see, Madeleine and then Vilhjálmur, right? Or yes, Kjetil. So do you want to? Yes. So Kjetil was first, I guess. I was not paying attention. Madeleine, right? Yeah. And please, if you could say your name first and then, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Matti. My name is Kjetil Rommetveit. I'm from Bergen. Thank you for a very nice talk. I just wanted to ask you a very simple question on the topic of your presentation. Apart from there being many philosophers in this meeting, is there a particular reason why truth is a topic in the context of the pandemic?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. In my first talk in this series years ago, I was talking about crisis leadership or crisis management as ethics communication. And my argument then was that at least the Finnish authorities did quite well in the beginning of the pandemic when they just went on stage and told what the authorities, the health authorities told them to say, namely just repeat the health utilitarian message. And for the first spring, up until June 2020, that went fine. So that gave me the idea that ethics communication, when our leaders are honest and truthful and open and transparent with us, then we are more obedient as citizens. Then it went all haywire because the economic things came in. Some people started talking about, like William Moore will now say, about values and solidarity and what have you, all that stuff that the health utilitarians cannot handle. And then it was all a shouting match again. But that's the background for me including truth-telling or openness or transparency in the management of the pandemic, that it makes us more obedient.
Thank you. And Vilhjálmur.
Yes, thank you very much, Matti. It was entertaining and very interesting. I also perhaps have a question related to truth. I wonder if truth is your concern. I think you clearly had in mind being transparent about meeting the criterion of publicity, let's say. But first, I mean, perhaps in a situation of uncertainty, it's very hard to say what would be telling the truth about the consequences of your actions. And then also whether many of these things aren't simply essentially contestable, so they are always a matter of debate and not really in the end a matter of finding out the true statement in the end. So yeah, I was wondering if truth is simply a too strong question here.
Thank you very much, Hayenhjelm. About the uncertainty, I think that in some version, I have covered that by just saying that if they are uncertain, then it's sufficient that they say that they are uncertain. Research Institute X said this, but they said it with these and these caveats, and we add these and these caveats because Research Institutes B and C are saying something else. So all the uncertainty should actually be also expressed. What happens with our obedience when they start saying things like that? We don't really. Let's think about that later in the project. Contestability, same thing. If the truth is contestable, then they should be saying that. And same question: do we then believe them in anything? This is bad. It might not be truth, but it's something very much like truth. It is. Well, I use the words of openness and transparency a lot, but I somehow seem to be of the opinion that it all boils down to true words coming from their lips, true words about how things are, or true things about how they don't know how things are, or they think they know how things are, but someone else is disagreeing with them. I hope that this makes some sense, because this goes into resilience later on, and of course we're now getting the funding because all the anonymous reviewers are in the room, and you can convince them further that we get the funding. But yes, those are all very good points, and we'll take them into account. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have one more question, and then probably not time for any more. Madeleine.
Well, this wasn't so much a question as an attempt to see if I could respond to the question posed by Matti, but now I can't quite remember what it was. But I was thinking maybe where truth-telling sits uncomfortably when you spell out all the values that underscores the decisions you're making, is there not a call here for self-transparency that you seem to be advocating? That there is an exercise in being transparent to yourself about what the reasons and values that goes in. And if something is problematic to communicate, we're ignoring the plight of the vulnerable here. Maybe that's a time to reflect and reconsider the decisions, and maybe we have given too little thought on the position of the vulnerables, and then perhaps it's a slightly different decision that needs to be made and communicated.
Yes, thank you very much. That you just reminded me of the real purpose of the project that Tuija and I are having, and the point at all times is to get the decision makers, whether they be civil servants or politicians, get them to reflect on what they are saying. And so this is partly a response to William as well. Our aim is to teach our leaders non-dominating, what's the German word? What was but you know what I mean, the non-dominated discussion and discourse, that would be the aim. So we are actually in an Aristotelian task here, trying to make our leaders more virtuous by by being more. It's not in the end their openness, it's in their openness to listen to other views, I think. Did I answer your question at all? I think I did somehow, a little bit.
You did somehow. If I, just to close this, I'm tempted to add also that your talk reminded me of an analysis that Bernard Williams made of truthfulness, saying that it has two components. And one is sincerity, just being interested in the truth, wanting to find out and tell the truth. And the other is what he calls the virtues of accuracy, which is just includes the ability and alertness towards appraising your sources and assessing the credibility, what comes under the heading of critical thinking and evaluation and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that much of what you are saying seems to require from politicians that they have both of these things. They absolutely have to have sincerity, but also they have to also have virtues of accuracy in order to be able to have insights into their own, the premises of their own views, and to be able to communicate those and say how they have evaluated information and based on what principles and so on and so forth. And this is a high demand on politicians, and there's no school for politicians that they need to pass exam in order to become politicians. So we are all potential politicians as citizens. So I wonder what, as a final comment, how far do you think politicians in the Nordic countries, and maybe in Finland in particular, because you're located there, how far do you think they have come close to or fallen short of this ideal virtue of politicians being truth seekers, sort of adequate and able truth seekers and sincere?
I think that they are trying to be as sincere as they can, but they had their limitations. It's just that in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was this 3-month time window when they could be more sincere than usually, because it was a sort of the world is breaking apart unless we do what the public health authorities tell us to do. So it was just easier for them. That was a test for them. Now they are back to being less sincere and less accurate, perhaps. I don't know. Now we have another crisis. But the rest of what you said about sincerity and accuracy, I recorded it, and it will go into my paper on this as my text, and there will be no mention of you anywhere.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matti, Häyry, and let's give him a good round of applause. All right. So now we are 8 minutes off schedule, but that's by design because Matti will not be with us afterwards. Our next speaker is Göran Collste, Professor Emeritus at Linköping University, where he was Professor of Applied Ethics for many years. He's a member of the Swedish National Council on Medical Ethics and was one of the main people behind the report on ethical choices in a pandemic that was published by that council in May 2020. He gave the second talk in our webinar series, and that was in November 2020, on ethical choices in a pandemic, and now follows up with a talk entitled Global Solidarity or Nationalism During a Pandemic.
Thank you. We forget quick. You really remember the seminars. Now other questions are in the forefront. But one thing that I remember from the beginning of this pandemic was, as this title in the program says, that nationalism was more important at least than global solidarity. You remember the airplane in Bangkok? In Bangkok, it was stopped by, I think, the American authorities because they shouldn't transport medical equipment somewhere, but it should be directed to the US. You remember the border of France that was closed because there was some medical equipment that should be transported to Sweden. that was nationalism really in the beginning, and very little solidarity, even between like Sweden and Norway and the Nordic countries. So that's a broad, wide, and important discussion. I think, though, that this will be my focus, because I think this is the most important question we should discuss in the relation to global solidarity and nationalism today, and that is the question about the distribution of vaccines, and what has happened and what will happen. It also goes back to my own research interest for many years on global justice and questions related to that. I focus on vaccines, and I will show you a small outline, see if this works. Should I just... yes, it works. Fantastic. I will say 5 things, so to say, but with more or less time in each. I would say first something about the facts about the global vaccine distribution during this pandemic. I will say something then going on to the ethics. First the facts and then the ethics. What are ethical principles should be guiding this, and what should we strive for, so to say. I will identify 2 positions that has been identified in the discussion, I think. One you can call vaccine cosmopolitanism, and the other vaccine nationalism. I will discuss them, and I will propose a middle way between these positions in order to come to a conclusion, and then say something about the practical implication. What should we then do? So that is my outline for my speech. I will start with a very hopeful message that was delivered in the summer of 2020. An article in Washington Post with the headline, "The international community must guarantee equal global access to COVID-19 vaccines." And it was not signed by anyone. It was signed by 9 leaders of the world, by Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, by Stefan Löfven of Sweden, by Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, Pedro Sanchez in Spain, and some other leaders. The international community must guarantee equal global access to COVID vaccines. That's really a very, very radical, and even more so. It's said in this article, and that has given the name to my speech here, "Where you live should not determine whether you live, and global solidarity is central to saving lives and protecting the economy." That was the message that was delivered by these world leaders. And it's an important message when you consider the health budgets of different countries in the world. This is just a sample of some. Armenia can spend $407 per capita, US dollars per capita per year. Bangladesh, 36. Congo, 20. Sweden, 5,900. And you say about the double per person per capita on health budgets. Of course, you can say something about the figures, but still, this shows the global gaps, if not least, the global gaps when it comes to health resources. And considering that 1 dose of Moderna's vaccine costs something like $25, you can say that Congo and Bangladesh cannot buy very many of these doses because of their budgets. So what happened? Back to vaccines. Well, just quite soon in the autumn 2020, we can read this headline: "Richest countries already bought 80% Pfizer vaccine." And this was even before the Pfizer vaccine had appeared, because we know that it was a very quick development, a unique quick development of vaccines, which was a fantastic management from researchers in the field. But anyway, it was at that time, it was not, and there were no any vaccines available. But already, the richest country had already bought the vaccines that would be produced. So this was a little a message coming and a development coming that came at least a little in contrast to the declarations from the world leaders, as we could see. One who went out early warning for this development was the WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who warned that the world was on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. So, what happened? And what has happened? You can see from this graph that the worries were realized. The hopes from the leaders from the summer were so far not realized. You can see here that when vaccines became really available for the greater public in our countries, that was, say, this June 2021, you can see that there was something like up to 60%, 50-60% vaccinated already in the upper middle income countries and in the high income countries. For myself, I was going to be vaccinated in, I think, April 2025, get my first dose. The same day I caught COVID, so I was a little delayed in this process myself. But there was this broad campaigns in all our countries, but not in some countries. In the low-income countries, still there were like 2%, almost not noticeable in this graph. And so it has went on. Now when we have like 70-80% vaccinated in all the countries, low-income countries have managed now about 15% at the present. 15% of the population that has got at least one dose of vaccines. That's a fact today. But is this really a problem? The message we got was also that, well, it's not a problem because of the younger population in the poor countries. They don't need the vaccines as much as we do, who have all these elderly who will be ill and perhaps also die from COVID-19. However, now I think we have seen information that this position seems to me more justifying an unjust distribution rather than telling us the facts. Because when any case of COVID comes into some of these countries, they are so fragile, they cannot manage COVID. So they had to make, in many of these countries, very, very harsh lockdowns, which had really had very devastating effects, noticeable food insecurity, poverty-related diseases, loss of education, and furthermore, economists could show quite recently that COVID-19 death toll is 4 times higher in lower-income countries than in rich ones. If you see all the deaths that come out from not only death by COVID, but also by all the things that have come with COVID, you see that there is as much need for vaccines in these countries, in the poor countries, than in the rich countries. Okay, these were the facts about vaccine distribution, how it has developed. Now to the ethics part then. We remember the Tedros said that this is a moral scandal, he even said, what's happening here? In our report that I informed about last time I spoke to this audience, Etiska vägval vid en pandemi, we formulated some principles for how we should tackle the whole pandemic. And one chapter was devoted to this question that I am addressing now, and we formulated global justice and international solidarity as important principles. In line with these declarations that we saw the world leaders made the summer before. These principles can be part of this position that I call vaccine cosmopolitanism, the effort to be more generous, to include everyone in the world in the need. And that's the basis for this position would say that every human being, irrespective of nationality, has the same right to vaccination against fatal viruses, including then COVID-19. I suppose really that most of us would agree to this position, in principle at least, because there are some very important basic ethical underpinning of this. First, the principle of human dignity, människovärdesprincipen, that we have as a basic principle for distribution of healthcare resources in all our countries, I'm sure. Each human life is of equal importance, and each human life is equally valuable. Very difficult to question. If you start to question this principle, I think we are leaning towards very problematic positions. So this is, and then that would imply that a person living in say, Congo has the same right to what is important for survival than anyone living in, for example, Sweden. The other, one other underpinnings of this is can relate to luck egalitarianism, that is called in the ethical language now. The natural lottery decides who we will be. We cannot decide our parents. Our parents can be rich or poor. They can be intelligent or stupid. And we have to live with that. But we should not be worse off because of a poor luck in the natural lottery. That is the content of luck egalitarianism. And also, of course, if you happen to be born in Congo or you happen to be born in Sweden, it's also a matter of luck. And this should not decide our life chance. I think that's also very, in my view, very convincing principle for a kind of a cosmopolitan position. But as we see, this has not been the guiding principle. And has it not been the guiding principle because of just poor greed that Oxfam has argued for? Or just self-interest? And self-interest is, of course, also often very much in conflict with our moral beliefs. Well, perhaps not anyway. I think there are some good reasons also. We can say that there are some reasons for vaccine nationalism. Vaccine nationalism would say that citizenship is a relevant factor for decisions on priorities of vaccination. So it's not irrelevant. It is relevant. And you mentioned here Bernard Williams. I think Bernard Williams is one of those who have questioned, or at least put some question mark to a kind of a cosmopolitan worldview, and arguing for some kind of nationalism. And when we relate it to vaccination and global vaccination, one could argue that, well, the whole point with the state and the government is that they should serve their citizenry, so to say, that they should serve the people in the country. And government is in some way based on contractual obligations entailing moral principles, trust, solidarity, and promises. So the citizens should expect that the politicians try to get as much vaccines, for instance, or other resources for survival and a good life. And that the political leaders for one country anyway have primary moral obligation to their fellow citizens. I think these seem to be reasonable positions, and therefore we stand here to confront conflict, which of course makes it very interesting. Applied ethics is about trying to find ways out of moral conflicts. We saw some very, very strong arguments for the cosmopolitan position, and we saw that there are anyway some arguments for why there could be justified, political leaders could be justified in serving their own citizens in this way. How should we solve this? Well, I would not say I have a solution, because it seems to be sometimes conflicts that are very difficult to make kind of a very happy solution from. But my suggestion would be some kind of a modified vaccine cosmopolitanism. But I will warn you, it will anyway have some kind of very radical implications. I would formulate it this way. My proposal is that states have the right to act in accordance with their obligation to their citizens, as long as the global population has sufficient level of resources for living a good life. The father has a right to help his child with buying some more candy, but as long as there are not starving children outside who are going to die if this resource is not going to them. I mean, that seemed to be the moral intuition here that would lead us forward. It will mean that each human being, irrespective of nationality, has the same right to vaccinate against COVID due to this view of human dignity, etc. So then, where you live does not determine whether you live, at least not with regard to the corona pandemic. So that would be my suggestion here. And I would say that this has, as I said, some, in the present, quite radical implications. We had one discussion in Sweden about children vaccination. You have perhaps had it in your countries also. Should we vaccinate children from the age 5 to 11 or something like that? We know that at that moment at least, there were very small, so to say, threats to children from COVID. I mean, they usually didn't get infected, etc. And when, if they did, you didn't even notice it. Should we invest a lot of doses for the children's vaccination in order to, or should we donate them to low-income countries where healthcare personnel, elderly, doesn't have access to any vaccines? For some of us, it was quite obvious that we should not vaccinate children for exactly these reasons, that they were so much needed, and that would be following also this principle. Of course, COVAX is then one way to then donate, and has been one way to donate vaccines in order to live up to this more so cosmopolitan position. That would be one way to, in practice, implement this principle. More donations to COVAX. How many doses have then been donated? Well, this is not the most recent figures, but they say something about the amount, which is, I don't know, I would say fair enough. 7 million Denmark, Finland 3 million, Norway 6 million, Sweden 10 million, although 28 million doses have gone to Swedes from also the Swedish vaccination programs. We can discuss the level, but I would anyway say, according to this moral argumentation, that is too little. Another path could be to try to increase the spread of production of vaccines, so more can get access in this way. A barrier here have been patent rights. The patent rights in one way was a way to stimulate the production, although it was very much also due to all these resources that the government in the rich countries gave to the pharmaceutical companies. But as you are surely aware of, in October 2020, South Africa and India proposed to the WTO, who managed the patent rights globally, that there should be a waiver of patent rights temporarily because of increasing vaccine production. There was a big no from many countries. There was a big yes from any more countries. There were like more than 100 countries, members of the WTO, thought that it was an excellent idea. Could start production of vaccines in different countries with generic vaccines in order to increase the number of vaccines in the world and the amount of vaccines in the world. If you look at the map of who said no and who said yes, we can identify them by which continent you belong to, except in fact US Biden, who favored this proposal. So did also Macron, and so did not the leaders of our countries. Until very recently, there seems to be a change here. So although, as the editorial in Nature say, patent waiver on on COVID vaccines is right and fair, there were big opposition from countries hosting pharmaceutical companies, and of course the pharmaceutical companies themselves. We saw this as a threat to their product through the selling and the profits, of course. But in March this year, there was a welcome from the WTO chief of a COVID shot patent plan that should be implemented, although the drug makers were very much still opposing it. And it seems that the discussion is going on. This is from the WTO homepage in May. TRIPS Council, here's initial reactions on Quad's outcome document of IP COVID-19 response. That is, they have started the process. Although this is 1.5 years after the proposal first was put on stage by South Africa and India. So this is how it stands right now. And we know that the pandemic is anyway still going on, although we sometimes tend to forget it because there are other questions coming up. But in conclusion then, the position that I call modified vaccine cosmopolitanism would encompass both principles of global justice and international solidarity on the one hand, and the duties of governments to their citizens on the other hand. As soon as we have this basic threshold that everyone has access to the life-saving COVID doses, the governments could prioritize their own populations. It provides a midway solution between vaccine cosmopolitanism and vaccine nationalism. That was the purpose with this. And then it corresponds to the declarations of world leaders of international solidarity in a time of pandemic. Remember still the fantastic declaration made by all these world leaders. And it's realized through the joint efforts of the different organizations here that are involved in trying to increase then now the doses of vaccine in the world. So, is this the world we see in front of us when it comes to vaccines? Some of us have access to the vaccine shop. Others cannot even reach the number to get to the queue. Besides, of course, which always come up in this discussion, but I take it as a last argument, no one is safe until everyone is safe. That is, as long as there is COVID anyway in the world, in a globalized world, that's a threat to all of us. So there are also some kind of self-interest here. Okay, you who want to read more about this argumentation can read a new article in Ethics and Global Politics with the same title that I've just published. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Göran. Lots to think about there. Our next speaker is Katarina Katoir? Is that? No. Yeah, anyway, you can correct me. Anyway, she is Associate Professor in Health Law, Faculty of Law at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She is or was the principal investigator on a project mapping legal responses to COVID-19. And this was funded by the Danish Council for Independent Research. She spoke in our webinar series in April of 2021. And then she was focusing our attention on the health and human rights perspective. And today she follows up with a talk entitled Human Rights During a Pandemic.
Thank you so much. Yes, so when I gave my talk, I was trying to really focus on what I describe as health and human rights issues. So health and human rights is a field that argues for incorporating human rights standards into health laws and policies, because sometimes health laws and policies have aims or means that can have human rights impact. I think at the time the situation was quite different. I think one of the interesting things with COVID has been the many changes in the policies, in the legal approaches, in the societal approaches to this pandemic. So my feeling at that point was that there was in some ways a more limited look at human rights, and there was strong backing up, at least in some countries, in the Scandinavian countries, for the government intervening and using law. And that human rights concerns were in some ways secondary to this, that yes, the government should conform with human rights, but really the focus was on addressing the pandemic. I think this changed, and we've just heard about vaccines, and I think that was a very interesting issue, this idea of we all really wanted the vaccine for the first year, and then the vaccines came, and some people, like myself, really wanted them, and then other people started to oppose at least being pressured to get a vaccine. So really what I wanted to look at here is sort of 2 years on, what human rights issues have we become aware of, and what human rights issues have we seen discussed. I should start off with a quick disclaimer. I work at the Faculty of Law, so I'm a legal researcher. I'm not a philosopher or an ethicist, so don't ask me any hard questions. So I just sort of want to use this talk to say briefly what we may have learned. That's a big question. And actually, I'm more going to focus on showing you what some human rights bodies have found. Because as was mentioned, I was leading this project where we were looking at COVID laws from a human rights perspective. And at the start, well, we didn't have the funny thing about law is we're usually waiting for a law or for a court or a tribunal to decide on something. So a lot of what I was saying was really, qualified speculation. So now we actually have quite a lot of decisions, and courts move very slowly, if any of you have ever come in contact with the legal system. So really for the next probably 5 years, we're going to still see court decisions coming down. So, COVID may be over for some, but the legal questions will linger on. So just to sort of mention this health and human rights perspective, just to hone your attention to that, as I said, it seeks to infuse human rights in health laws and policies, and it acknowledges health as a human right, not just an interest. So health, like privacy, is a human right, and it also opposes discrimination and stigma as a public health strategy. So what are states' obligations? Just to sort of summarize, all Nordic states have ratified a number of relevant treaties, which have something or other to say about health. So some of the most important ones are summarized here, but generally, to briefly say that it is accepted by ratifying these treaties that states have undertaken to adopt measures to protect the population's health from pandemics and to prepare for pandemics. It's also worth mentioning there's also a WHO, World Health Organization treaty, which nobody seems to have ever heard of. I hear a lot of people saying that the WHO is in the process of negotiating a pandemic treaty, and this is very exciting because it's the first pandemic treaty. There is actually a treaty already. And this treaty does recognize human rights as important considerations. So it's just to state there is obligations on states, but they're very broadly framed. And I suppose when the pandemic hit, these broad norms have something to say, but they're not exactly a blueprint for exactly what a state can and cannot or should not do. So what I did in preparation for this talk was to actually look at what different human rights bodies have been saying, in the last year. And a lot of recommendations have actually come. So just a selection of these is that different committees are giving recommendations about things that I think have really been highlighted, especially in the last year of the pandemic, as particularly problematic from a human rights perspective. One of these is the rights of people with disabilities, We've obviously all been affected by the pandemic, but some groups have been more affected than others. And one is people with disabilities. A lot of supports have been removed for people with disabilities during the pandemic. And this can also have more severe consequences, in particular if you have intersectional issues such as poverty, for example. So the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, for example, has issued recommendations on this topic. The next is another group who you could describe as particularly vulnerable, for example. And this, in this case, this is a recommendation to Kuwait about a group of stateless people, for example, who are struggling to get access to healthcare services. There's a recommendation to Tunisia, which is particularly focused on mental health services for children. And this is another human rights issue that has been particularly pronounced during the pandemic. It's not that children's mental health wasn't suffering before, but of course, if any of you have children or are around children, it has been very hard on some children and young people who, for example, couldn't access education outside the home for many years. And again, migrant, refugee, asylum seekers, these people have all been exposed to particular risks during the pandemic, again, often due to lack of resources, for example, not being able to go outside. This, we all know, is difficult, but if you live in poor conditions, if you have limited resources, all of these impacts are intensified. And then finally, the pandemic has also had a strong impact on certain groups of women, in particularly women who work in the informal economy, have lost their jobs, and have taken over care roles for example, their children, and thereby left the workforce. They are returning, but not at the same rate as they were in the workforce. So these recommendations just really highlight some main human rights issues that we have seen in the pandemic. And I think in the early days of the pandemic, a lot of people sort of described it as this great equalizer and, you know, this shared vulnerability. But I think really it's become clear that some groups, some people have been much more affected than others, and these are some examples of them. So we've also had some case law from the European Court of Human Rights, and we will continue to have case law. So just to highlight, to start with, that there are different principles. So human rights are not absolute, and governments can limit nearly all human rights, usually subject to what we call the principle of proportionality. So often people like to sort of say, I have a right to this and that's very nice. But usually there's limitations can be imposed on those rights, but they shouldn't go beyond, they shouldn't be disproportionate essentially. So limitations should, for example, be necessary and the least restrictive alternative available. So again, we've had the decisions so far from the European Court of Human Rights, again, are focusing on specific groups. I can just say that the court hasn't really engaged with questions on the pandemic affecting us as a whole. This is partly because of the way the court is set up. It's not really set up to deal with claims just because you're a person living in a state, but you have to actually be directly harmed to have a claim. So we've seen complaints relating to domestic violence. And for example, here, just in passing, the court did note the big increase in domestic violence during the pandemic, which particularly impacts women. And also there's been complaints relating to prisoners. Prisoners have again been a group who have suffered during the pandemic, and they're also a group that, of course, don't necessarily solicit the same level of solidarity or empathy. And here the court does find that there are limits to what a prison has to do to protect prisoners' human rights during the pandemic. So they can impose preventative measures, but they should not impose, they should not be an excessive burden on the authorities in view of the practical demands of imprisonment. There's also complaints relating to asylum seekers, and here an individual was held alone in a container for nearly 75 days without access to natural light or air, and they had no opportunity to exercise for 40 days. And then they were moved to quarantine with persons in COVID isolation, even though they had already been in isolation for such a long time. So why would you be placed in isolation with people who are suspected to have COVID-19? So those were some European cases. We've also had some national cases. So I just want to mention two of them. One is very recent from England. I think people have been so distracted by Boris Johnson and his partying ways that this really hasn't gotten enough focus and attention. And I think particularly our Swedish friends would be interested because there are a lot of parallels towards the findings that have been made in Sweden, but also probably in terms of all the Nordic countries. So one group who I really want to highlight is people who were living in care homes, predominantly older people, and they were in a really precarious position. And as we know, in most countries, or I guess in all countries, they were the people who died, who had the highest mortality during the pandemic. Of course, they are an elderly population and people have comorbidities, but still there's a lot of concern about the procedures that were in place. So in this recent case that was brought, it's actually really interesting, it was brought by the survivors, the children of someone who died in a nursing home, and the people actually crowdfunded to have the money to bring this case, and they were actually successful, which is kind of amazing in a way, if you know anything about the legal system, to really go through the legal system and have success at that high level, just sort of goes to show how problematic the situation was. So here, the finding was that the policy of the government, of the health system was irrational. And here, basically, it was that an asymptomatic patient or a patient who had been in a hospital could be returned to a nursing home without being placed in isolation, without being tested. And we know this from other countries. We know this from New York, for example, that basically transferring a person from a hospital where there was a lot of outbreaks directly to a nursing home, it resulted in the disease spreading to the nursing homes, and where people are living close together and where people are vulnerable, especially prior to the vaccines, the disease in some cases just really ripped through the nursing homes, and many people unfortunately died. So the other example, which some of you may be familiar with, is a decision from Germany, and this relates to triaging and basically the rights of people with disabilities. So here the Constitutional Court basically states that there must be a policy in place for triaging to ensure that people with disabilities aren't discriminated or aren't disadvantaged, because basically there's too high a risk that a person with disabilities will present and need care, and that they may be discriminated against in a high pressure situation. Not because any health professional intends to do so, but because they're overwhelmed and because people have biases. So again, really focusing on these obligations to protect vulnerable people. And finally, another example is from Sri Lanka, and I just found it an interesting example because it wasn't something I had thought about or necessarily I'm familiar with, but it relates to actually what's been happening in some countries where people were being cremated after they died suspected of COVID-19. And obviously this was posed as a sanitary measure, but in some religions, like Islam, the people were complaining because this was contrary to their religion to be burnt after death. And I think it really shows sort of the complexity and the importance of actually scientific evidence, because what the complaint is saying is really that there's actually no evidence that it's necessary to burn remains, and that's a helpful tool from a public health perspective. But it does have implications for people's right to religion, for example. So just to kind of sum up or to, conclude, one issue that I was really sort of struck by was this issue of people being fined for basically doing completely normal things, such as going out into nature, going for a walk, sitting in a park. It's one of these really puzzling things I found about the pandemic that sort of became more and more perplexing over time when it became clear that COVID is really, it's a really low likelihood of contracting COVID outdoors. But still in some countries like England, for example, you could be fined for meeting outside more than a certain number of people. And I know in Norway also that there was a lot of questions about this prohibition basically on people being able to go to their huts in the countryside. So for me, a nature lover, I found it really sort of perplexing that you're at a very precarious time where many of us, all you wanted to do was get outside, and it was very important for people's mental health, but at the same time, this could actually be against the law. So I'm sort of encouraged by the fact that there is more and more discussion about the idea of a right to access nature, and that can be viewed in light of some of the restrictions that we had, because it actually is very important for health, and we have to think of health in the broader sense, of course. And yes, we've had the COVID pandemic, but side by side this, we have another pandemic, and that's of chronic disease. And one important means of improving your health is actually physical exercise. So I'm hopeful that in the future that access to nature and access to the outside could be given a higher priority. So as was said, I was leading a project funded by the Danish Research Council. Some of this is part of a book chapter, and there's also an article that I've written with Nordic colleagues where we've looked at the rights of older people in all the different Scandinavian countries under the pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarina, for this very interesting talk, which I think validated our decision to have this continuous program. Because as you mentioned, the law moves slowly, and I think our brains move slowly also. We need to have the patience to talk about issues even after the main events have occurred, and there's time to reflect and learn, and that's what we're hoping to do today. Now we have a question and answers session for about 10 minutes or so. If you are listening on the live stream, please remember that you are encouraged to write questions in the Q&A option on the YouTube channel. People in the audience, please just raise your hands if you if you want to ask a question. And while you're thinking, maybe I will start with one question to Göran. I thought it was really interesting to see how you pitched against one another the arguments for nationalism and the arguments for cosmopolitanism, and you seem to favor the arguments for cosmopolitanism, or sort of imply that you thought they were probably the stronger arguments. And I think that may very well be correct, but then you developed your thesis in such a way that I think you favored some kind of a compromise between these two positions, so that to find that like a middle ground where states can fulfill their obligations to their citizens and at the same time fulfill their obligations as world citizens, so to speak, or moral obligations to human beings as such. And I was wondering in this context whether we could compare or draw like a parallel between the situation that states are in this respect and the situation that professionals are in with respect to their obligations to their individual clients on the one hand, or patients, for example, and then their obligations to the public at large. So if you are a psychiatrist, for example, you have your own patients and you have special obligations to those. If you're a teacher, you have special obligations to the students that you are entrusted with. But that doesn't mean you have no obligations on the mental health or the education of the public at large. And the ethics of professionalism aim to find ways of combining both of these. And I wonder if this is the same moral problem, really, that they have to solve and have solved in certain ways in the professional era, that the politicians are confronted with. And then if the political dilemma can maybe learn something from looking at professional ethics and how these dilemmas have been resolved. So yeah, that was my thought. So there are two more questions already. So, but Göran, maybe before we get more questions, if you want to respond to this.
Okay, shall I go here and
please.
say that? Yeah, that's a good analogy. I think that's what is the point with professional ethics, to think in these terms, that we have as a professional certain duties as a university teacher to your students, etc., etc. Although there is, of course, some differences here, because you can say that everyone needs knowledge, or everyone needs care, and if a doctor finds a patient or finds some ill person on the street, so he has some, or she has some duty to intervene here, and although it's not his or her patient. So you can say that this is an analogy, but when it comes to states, there is more easy to see how there are conflicting duties here, because beside the duties to your own citizens, you can also choose to donate everywhere at the same time. So there is more of a conflict of resources, which I think, as I argued for, has been sort of more for the nationalist position, and that has been the primary duty for the politicians. Although we know that you can make a choice that the resources can be given to, for example, COVAX instead. So in this way, it's easier for a politician to choose not to prioritize his or her own citizens. So that's a difference here, I think. But the thought structure is similar, I think. Yeah. And sometimes in global justice discussion, we tend to perhaps be too idealistic and don't see it and not neglect the duties that the state has or government has to its own citizens. So I think that would be my little contribution here, to emphasize that these duties are real, and therefore it's so you should, because a complete egalitarian position would say that all medical resources would be distributed equally around the world, so to say. That's a kind of ideal position, but it's also what implies can, said the first speaker here. I mean, it has something to do with that also. I mean, you have to have some realism in your theories, but still not leaving the principles behind. I mean, that's a way to go ahead, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and then of course there is the Kantian distinction between perfect and imperfect duties, where you could say that as a professional you have a perfect duty to your client and an imperfect duty to society, so that if you just neglect the social responsibilities altogether, then you are failing in your duties. Maybe that is also relevant here. We could discuss this further if we had time, but thank you. I think Vilhjálmur was next, and then Salvor, and then please raise your hand if you have more questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Göran. I probably misunderstood you, but then you could clarify, because my understanding was that the government would have first obligation to the citizens so long as the global population was had sufficient level of resource for living a good life. But then I was wondering, I mean, whose obligation is it? Is the first obligation then to contribute to everyone having this sufficient level of resources for living a good life on a global level? Isn't that the first obligation?
It was not exactly, I think, how I formulated it,
okay.
but now I forgot exactly how the formulation was. But the point is that you must accept the primary duties of governments to the citizenship. Although, when it comes to, for example, distribution of COVID vaccines, this should you have these duties, but when so far as the basic distribution of the global population, so that people survive, is satisfied, which is and becomes then one can say the primary obligation in this case. When people are, so to say, dying around you, you have an primary obligation to save them, and then you can prioritize your own families. So that would be my ideas here. That this would be the. Perhaps I formulated the miss. I will look back on my formulation so that makes clear. So you have, like a prima facie duties towards your citizens, and also towards, but which can become the actual duty to talk with more, I think was who have made this distinction. Then it will be the ones who doesn't survive. So that would be the primary duties for, even for, if you can do that, and you can as a decision maker, so to say, or as a government, or as a, so that would be the position.
Salvor.
Yeah, thank you. I'm probably just sort of similar in the similar area, because I was just wondering about, who has the obligation, and sort of on an international level, because you have the states, but then you have an international level, and you have pharmaceuticals that are international companies. And what are their obligations? I mean, they are also a big distributor, of course, having the product, and they might have the obligation, or the primary obligation, to be sort of look at global justice when they are distributing their product.
I get your question, and of course it's very true. And there are more agents who have obligations here. So I just. We don't live in a world state. That some people have argued for a world state. I think Torbjörn Tensch has argued for that because of this reason, that we need some global state in order to solve all these demanding problems that we are facing, sort of the climate crisis. But we don't live in. I think there's a lot of arguments against the global state also. But then we can anyway say that in the absence of a global state, we must assume that the decision makers in different states also take a global perspective, and that would be the idea of global justice here when it comes to that part. And then I would try to formulate it in this way, that you have obligations to your duties to your citizens, but as far just when the basic needs. So you should prioritize as a national decision maker government the the global levels also in this. But of course, when you talk about pharmaceutical companies who were funded, I mean, I still saw some figures, $100 billion or something that was put in this, and then they get property rights to the products, and they are very unwilling to even accept a temporary waiver of these rights, which could increase the production of I mean, that's really problematic, and of course one could say that these pharmaceuticals have obligations, as you say, to donate donate very much. They have profited very much, and there's a number of new billionaires from these companies, Pfizer and Moderna and so on. I think the only company that have had a fairly decent policy is AstraZeneca, who has in fact lowered the prices and tried to have different ways of making their vaccines accessible in poor countries. But beside that, it's really upsetting, I think, when you see how these policies have been, and even that they have the nerves to oppose a temporary waiver of patent rights, which is also in international law and the so-called TRIPS agreement accepted as a part of this patent law. That's a huge problem. Yes, that you point at.
Okay, as a final, just because I know, Katarina, you asked us not to ask you any difficult questions, but maybe I'm still tempted if you have any thoughts about, because what we've been discussing about the obligations of states toward their own citizens versus their obligations toward the world, with the human rights perspective, orient them more toward their own citizens or more toward their global obligations when we speak morally. So how does if you just take the human rights perspectives as a politician or as a government, which way would you lean, or how would you resolve this puzzle?
Yes. Well, I think it's not an easy answer, because I suppose it sort of depends on the approach. I mean, within the right to health, for example, there are obligations on states to obligations of international cooperation. But what exactly does this mean? And sort of as you were laying out, I mean, when does your obligation begin? I mean, is it that, okay, well, everyone in my country has now had access to the vaccine, so now I should cooperate? It's not particularly effective. So yes, there is this obligation, but I think the problem is that it's how it's interpreted. So I don't think human rights kind of gives the sort of great answer that you hope for. It doesn't really, it doesn't really answer the question with much certainty, because again, it's so open to interpretation.
And maybe that interpretation within the human rights community and courts and all that is dependent on the kind of ethical discussion that we are also having.
Yeah, completely.
Right.
And I mean, one other problem, just to mention quickly, is that the human rights system can be described as a weak system if you compare it to the system for international trade. So there's not the same sanctions for not complying with human rights as there are for not complying with patent obligations.
Right. Well, we've exceeded the time limit a little bit. So thank you very much, our speakers, for your excellent contributions and for the great questions that we received. And now we will take a break for 15 minutes. So now I have 14:39. So I guess it's 55. Five before 3. We start again. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to the next part of our program today. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and then Madeleine Hayenhjelm will take over as moderator after that. Our next speaker is Reidun Førde, and she is a medical doctor and professor emerita in medical ethics at the Center for Medical Ethics at the University of Oslo. She spoke at our lecture series also last year. This was in the winter of 2021. And now she will follow up with a talk called Norway After COVID. Well, you're yeah, more confident than we dare to be. Norway After COVID. This could be a reflection on the fact, or maybe a prediction, I don't know. Norway After COVID, lessons learned from bioethics. So Reidun Førde, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an excellent idea to get together and share experiences, although I'm afraid it's not over. So it was very easy for me to accept an invitation to come to Bergen, also because I'm from Western Norway, so it's always nice to come here. But I have to warn you that my conclusions, which are not maybe even conclusions, they are more questions and reflections, but they are all influenced from my position during the pandemic. And I think my private life was, of course, influenced by the pandemic, but also my professional life, as I have been dealing with the clinical ethics committee system, which is very well developed in Norway. It's in all hospitals and also many places in community care. And I'll share that experience with you, but also as a citizen, some conclusions or preliminary conclusions. Yeah. In the start, we knew very little, and I think the conclusion is that although it may not be over, we have learned a lot. We had to do decisions with insufficient knowledge. And I think now I'm coming to the first speaker from Finland today. I think the health authorities were, at least some of them, were quite open about the necessity to make mistakes. They said, we know too little, we have to decide, and of course, some mistakes will be made. I think that was very important for the trust. They didn't, at least some of them, didn't pretend. They showed their uncertainty, and I think that, at least for me, was very important for the trust. Yes. And then, for the first time, I think ethics became sexy. At least it felt like that for me, who have been working as a doctor, trying to convince my colleagues that ethics is important. Because suddenly, the value issues came high up in my country. Maybe not enough, but to some degree. So some of us were invited into working groups, as I told you about last time. And the first one was the vaccine prioritization working group, but also some other working groups. So, insufficient knowledge, but an imperative to act. We didn't know how the pandemic would develop. We didn't know how the disease was spread. Think about all the millions of gallons of disinfectants that we have used. We don't know how much that has protected us. The production of vaccines, we knew very little when we started to prioritize. I guess that's the conclusion, my most important conclusion. We didn't know the effect of the political measures. We didn't know how the social distancing would affect us, who would be most affected, how long it would last. It has obviously affected us. The closing down our working places. We started before this seminar today to discuss how it is more difficult now to arrange seminars because people want to do it digitally. Something has been lost, I think. And it's like that in working places too. People prefer to stay away. And there is also obvious and cost of reducing healthcare outside intensive care, which we did in Norway. We descaled other parts of the hospitals to strengthen intensive care. Many people would say we didn't do enough. Many people would say that for intensive care, but still we did. So ethics was requested, as I said, by health authorities and clinicians and even media. Suddenly we were asked to come on television and radio and talk about the ethical dilemmas. And very early on in the pandemic, we were contacted by ethics committees outside Oslo who said that our leaders have told us to be en garde, to give support to difficult decisions, and we need some backing up from you, which is the Center for Medical Ethics. So we created this website, and I'll come back to that. So, what are the conclusions? It seems that Norway so far has done well. We have relatively few deaths. We have a robust economy, and you will say, thanks to the oil, yes. But still, we have come back to a good economy more quickly than I expected, at least. Society was closed down, but for not too long and not too extensively. And then, and here is my most important conclusion, I think, some things are difficult to calculate. I think the first lecture today was a very good illustration how you can make boxes and put words into it, but you don't get very far from there. But maybe the most difficult things to calculate are the most difficult to, or most important to calculate. There was an exception to the closing down, or a difference between the big cities, and in particular Oslo was closed more and more extensively down than more distant part of Norway. Yes. The things that are difficult to calculate definitely have ethical relevance. I realized that the title of my speech was Lessons Learned for Bioethics, but of course you can't separate bioethics and the rest of society. I think this day so far has shown that beautifully. Many of you have shown, I think, earlier today that the pandemic has made societies most vulnerable, extra vulnerable. The ones with anxiety and depression have become more anxious. Talking about truth, in Norway we had almost, it felt like daily conferences with the government on television stating how we should behave, new laws being made. I think it made something, had an effect on us. It should have an effect. That's what they wanted. But I think it made us maybe more anxious and more obedient, which was the idea, I guess. We have a wave. I don't know what it is, how it is in your countries outside Norway, but they're talking about a wave of young people with eating disorders, which is really a wave and a heavy burden on a psychiatry which has not enough resources already. Is it the pandemic, or is it something else? We don't know. But it seems like a new big wave. Next of kin, we're trying to include next of kin in a much better way in healthcare in general. Now suddenly next of kin was treated as a threat in hospitals and nursing homes. Our social and working lives have been changed. And because of the closing down, all these are interrelated, because of the closing down of hospital and nursing homes, existential moments in life were sacrificed on the altar of death. Because I have a rather, people know, I've been working in clinical ethics for too long. So people know me, and I've had, I don't know how many telephones I've had from relatives who could not be with their loved ones during the dying phase. It's a big sacrifice there, and they are carrying emotions for a long time afterwards. It's a cost. Then there is, or are some still unresolved moral dilemmas, which was very obvious when we were to give advice to the health authorities and politicians about prioritization of vaccines. We chose, as you may remember, to give priority to the most vulnerable in society, which was the oldest ones. And the people would ask, do the values of health and life trump all other values? A lot of critique. Well, justified, I think, critique. What about economy? What about people losing jobs? What about social life and social relations? Should the young ones sacrifice their social relation, their development, because we want to protect some who are going to die anyway? And following up this unresolved question, I think, in society, we should discuss it more than we have. Do all individuals have the same value? What about age? Is there an upper limit? We discussed that regarding intensive care. It caused a big riot, or older people were really scared. If we say no, not all people have the same value, what price is there to pay for that? I think that's an issue for us all, and also for bioethics. A little bit about the network that I showed you, the slide. In first, there was obvious dilemmas related to prioritization for intensive care, for hospitalization, for vaccine. We discussed what about geographical considerations. Should we prioritize the densely populated area, as our group did suggest that we should? It was impossible for political reasons for a long time. And then they made some kind of, they gave a little bit more to Oslo, which had a much heavier burden and protective equipment. In the start, most of it went to hospitals. out where people were dying, and nurses and nurses' aides had to work with very little protective equipment, which is, I think, to me, thought-provoking. We didn't care too much about it. And then there were some odd moral dilemmas that came in, questions to the ethics network. How far is it okay to go to protect my loved ones at home from me bringing the virus home? What about collegial loyalty? We withheld, we don't like to talk too much about that, but in the start we withheld some non-invasive ventilation treatment to people who obviously could have survived, because we didn't know their status, whether they had COVID when they came in with breathing problems or not, due to insufficient knowledge at that time. Rules for visiting of next of kin, and yeah. So, what kind of support did healthcare need? We know that both from our experience and also from a paper made here in Western Norway by Ingrid Miljeteig, that the most important was collegial support. Then the government developed guidelines, and here, as I already have told you, ethicists played an active role. They said, here are some value issues. We need some people who can work with values and prioritization issues to give us advice. Also regarding passport, COVID passport, and lowering the age of vaccine to children. Ethicists were involved here. So, but just some odd issues that came to us. Should a youth with mental retardation be vaccinated against physical resistance? Law said no. Doctors and parents said yes. A pandemic and vaccination disbeliever is brought to hospital. He receives life-saving healthcare. Should we treat him with force? Should a patient who refuses COVID vaccination receive a new organ when we know that the mortality is much higher if he gets COVID after receiving organ? So, lessons learned for Norway. Advanced care planning should be strengthened. After all, we live in a good society built on trust. Trust was important during the pandemic. And global injustice was hardly an issue, I think, in Norway, at least around me. Not enough. I think that's embarrassing. And the pandemic has strengthened the hierarchy in society. The well-off are today more well-off. The poor are probably, or the poorer. And in healthcare. Intensive care, the acute care, the hierarchy here was on top. We hardly saw anything else in the start. Community healthcare was hardly focused on. And of course, globally, the pandemic has strengthened the hierarchy. And ethnicity. This has not been talked much about, but people coming from Asia, Africa, were much more often hospitalized, put in intensive care, died, and people would whisper, they don't care, they don't care. I think, in a way, racial issues or negative racial issues were strengthened at that time, which is a cost. So, finally, lessons learned for ethics. I think in times of crisis, Ethics must communicate with the ones out there. We need a bottom-up ethics. That's not too easy for philosophers, I think. We need philosophers too, but in times of crisis, we need something which can communicate with the people out there. And I think our ethics network was useful. Obviously, we put too much weight on a utilitarian position. What about relation ethics, virtue ethics? Hardly an issue. We did not protect the most vulnerable in society outside age, I think. But who are these? Talking about telling truth, we still maybe do not know enough who were the most vulnerable. And were we too submissive and obedient, too little critical towards political directives? I think we were. Yeah. So, I think that was my last one.
Well, thank you so much. I think we'll move straight on to our next speaker, who will be Viljamur Arnason, who is also a professor of philosophy and the chair for the Center of Ethics at the University of Iceland. And he will talk about policy and principles in a pandemic, moral lessons learned. I think so, yes.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks a lot to the organizing committee and for the Nordic Bioethics Committee for inviting me to speak. I have a long-term relationship to this committee. I was on it for a few years and always enjoyed the work and have enjoyed this program. I took quite seriously the ethics of a pandemic, lessons learned in the Nordic countries. So I quite along the lines of writing, I think I'm reflecting on the Icelandic experience. Somewhat not in, I mean, I gave a talk here in the webinars that has been mentioned, and there I reflected on COVID as it was going on, and I used sort of an analytical framework from David Miller, a political philosopher in Oxford, to sort of organize my thoughts. And now I seek a framework, another framework, which may surprise someone here. I will evaluate the handling of the Icelandic authorities of the pandemic and consider the lessons to be learned from that. I think it's useful to, the only situation I really know in a national context is the Icelandic one, and I'd like to sort of to lead it, my analysis to earth through that, and frame it in terms of the idea of accountability for reasonableness, which is actually was intended for a quite different task. It provides 4 criteria for facilitating legitimate and fair priority setting in healthcare generally, often abbreviated A4R. But I employ the main idea because I thought it was useful, and the reason I've been thinking and working with Kristín Berger, for example, using this idea and in a different context, but I employ it here in the current context in order to hold policy makers accountable for the reasonableness of decisions and improve their legitimacy by reflecting on our experience of the Icelandic handling of the pandemic. Now, the 4 conditions that are provided by Norman Daniels and Sabine are publicity, relevance, revision and appeals, and regulation. I put regulation in parentheses because I don't think I'll say anything about that, but I will discuss these key elements of a fair process, as it's called. It's a procedural framework which actually is intended to achieve fair decisions of prioritization in health in a liberal democratic society where there are conflicts about values and priorities. So at least we can perhaps agree on the fairness of the process. explain their significance for handling of the pandemic and relate them to the Icelandic experience of COVID-19. I think what is useful about this framework is that it enables both assessment of the policy, actual policies, and the lessons we may draw from it. Now, first to the publicity criterion. I think that has already been mentioned. Matti, in the first talk, when he talked about truth-telling and truthfulness, was at least implicitly appealing to very similar ideas. This condition is, of course, a major factor in democratic decision-making, often discussed in terms of transparency. There are papers that discuss the difference between transparency and publicity, but I won't make anything of that. What is important here is that it relates to both which decisions are made and for what reasons. Accountability for reasonableness implies assessment of the reasons. Do they stand to scrutiny? And in this case, specifically to moral scrutiny. And although epistemological scrutiny is also important. And these are conditions for trustworthiness and fairness. Norman Daniels has a nice phrase that focuses on the key moral idea here. There must be no secrets where justice is involved, for people should not be expected to accept decisions that affect their well-being unless they are aware of the grounds for those decisions. This is obviously crucial in a pandemic, and I think that many of the controversies about policies may be rooted in alleged secrecy or hidden conflict of interest, and that's what the demand for publicity really handles or addresses. That people should be aware of the decisions that really affect their lives, and I think this was really also a theme in the last talk. Now, in the Icelandic context, I think that the publicity criterion was generally well met. Policy decisions were clarified and defended publicly, for example, in very frequent press conferences. And it was in Iceland, these press conferences were very much listened to and seen on TV by the general public, and very much like Raiden just talked about, people were heeding these advice and were quite compliant, and I think often for very informed reasons, because we were very lucky. There were not politicians in Iceland that explained the policies, but three experts, the Troika, as we call them, who in a very sort of clear and sincere manner explained the policies and the reasons behind them. So I think this was very much in the line with the general requirement of publicity. Politicians gave the stage to experts and who showed this professional integrity and were open to criticism, and I think met what Matti was talking about. And I had a question in mind to him. Doesn't this his idea about expecting truthfulness from politicians, in a way, isn't it an argument for actually giving the stage to experts, because they really seem to observe this idea of that he was focusing on. The style was very much to express rather than impose community, as is put by Childress and others in their framework paper on public health ethics. The media had good access to data and reasons, but focused on numbers. And I think very much like Raiden just said, that there wasn't very much criticism or critical analysis of the policies, but very much sort of articulation of numbers and statistics, which often did not, perhaps were not very conducive to publicity in the end. Now I will take 3 examples of a lack of publicity. I think this is, here I come to a sort of a lessons learned. I think there are at least, I mentioned 3 examples that in the Icelandic context that I think we could take as a lack of publicity. And the first is a role of special interest groups and the effect their pressures had on policies. Of course, we have a very strong tourism industry, and that's the one I have in mind here. And restrictions at the border had drastic effects on the tourist industry. And there was, I think, quite a strong pressure from them on politicians and even on the experts. But and this, I think, is very interesting here and has not received enough attention that prominent economists in Iceland, because the argument seemed to be on behalf of those who were sort of arguing for lessening restrictions, that it would be economically feasible to try to have continued tourism. But prominent economists argued that the loss was exaggerated and stringent policies at the border were economically feasible. And that because Icelanders would become the tourists and they would expend quite well, and they would not spend the money they spent luxuriously abroad. They would spend it in Iceland. And so the economic reasons provided for this slackening of policies at the border at crucial times were not transparent enough. Now, which flies in the face of publicity then. Also, of course, the other major benefit of that it would facilitate both cultural life and schooling in Iceland. And the arguments for these measures were not fully transparent, as I just said, these stringent measures or lessening the measures at the borders. Politicians, I think, were shielded from answering for these decisions, and perhaps that was because the experts were in the front and they were not sort of answering for these decisions often well enough, and politicians were, I think, could have, but I'm sure they perhaps didn't want to often explain fully the reasons for their decisions there. Here, I think the meaning of liberty is important in this context, because often arguments for or against strict measures were about that these were restrictions of liberty. And of course they are, but liberty is always a contextual thing. As Feinberg puts it in a nice way, sort of the formula is that X is free from hindrances in order to do something or say something he or she prefers. And we always, when we talk about liberty or freedom, we always need to fill in these blanks there. We could, for example, say that A is free from restrictions to cross the border, or B is free from restrictions to operate her tourist business. Now, these were, I think, very prominent in the discussions of liberty, of restrictions of liberty, but much less the next two possibilities of filling in. C is free from quarantine to attend school, which I think is a very important liberty in this context. Or D is free from staying home in oppressive conditions to whatever C would like to do. And this relates to domestic violence that Raiden was mentioning before. Now, as a rule, the state should not have a view on the aim towards which X uses her liberty, except in order to prevent harm. This is the classical liberal position. But in exceptional cases, like in a pandemic, the state, I think, could well justify prioritizing schooling of the young. I think that would be quite a justifiable argument, and in the spirit of accountability for reasonableness, because I'm sure that the public, if the public had been sort of faced with that explicitly, and in an informed way with these options, they would have favored more freedom from quarantine and schooling. Now, a second example that I mention here is a much more sort of specific one, guidelines for prioritization, which relates well to the last talk. I only discovered sort of late in the pandemic that there was a document on the website of the National Hospital. This is a translation here, COVID-19, prioritization of admission to intensive care units and decisions about the end of intensive care. So this is explicitly a COVID-19 related document. And of course, having it on the website is, well, a minimal publicity condition. But there was no public discussion of this document, no dialogue or even effort made to discuss this publicly, even though it has quite controversial guidelines. For example, AIDS-related, which I found quite striking, that there's an explicit demand for clinical frailty assessment for anyone at 65 or over. And fortunately, the situation in Iceland never became that bad that this needed to be tested. But the document is there, and I think it's an important example of something that relates to what I said before, that people need to be presented with the reasons publicly that may affect their lives at crucial times. So this is, I think, a lack of publicity here, and perhaps people see this as a sensitive matter, that this was not the time to present this on the public scene. But and one could ask, are such guidelines simply a matter of professional discretion or evaluation, or is there a need for a public dialogue? And I think that the criterion of publicity, at least, is very much in arguing in spirit of that, would be a strict yes to this answer. The timing of it is perhaps another matter. Now the third example I mentioned of a lack of publicity is perhaps a rather peculiar one in Iceland, because a very big player on the scene, Decode Genetics, which is a major international research company and a very strong scientific company, was a very big player in this whole episode in Iceland, but doesn't have any role in the democratic system of governance, of course. And in such cases, of course, it's the role of the government perhaps to make some kind of an agreement with such private actor in order to undertake the very important tasks that this player did take on. They made very important contribution to testing, screening, and sequencing, but not apparently, and it was explicitly mentioned by the CEO of the Decode Genetics that no agreement had been made with the government, that this was sort of basically an oral discussion, and almost because of friendship with the chief epidemiologist and so on. But nevertheless, this big player put questionable pressure more than once, both on politicians and regulators. And for example, there was a case for the Data Protection Agency, where the Data Protection Agency was critical of the handling of decode of data, and the company reacted extremely fiercely and against this regulator, who was acting, I think, in good faith and according to existing regulation. And the interaction with the company was characterized by attitudes of gratitude and even awe rather than accountability for reasonableness. And this here, I think we encounter the question of power, the role of power in a case like this. I really don't know how to handle this. It's a very special case, but I think this is something that we as a nation need to discuss. Also because it has been very clear that this company should simply, or not simply, exclusively do research. But in this case, the boundaries between research and the clinical were very much blurred. And I have a doctoral student who is now looking explicitly into that, and that is, we will find out better later how exactly these lines were crossed. And perhaps it's beneficial and even desirable to cross these lines, but then it needs to be explained publicly and the reasons provided for that. So this is another sort of, I think there are many things that are very unclear here. A popular player talking about democracy, I mean, I think if the nation was asked, there was very much people were very happy with the contribution of decogenetics and democratically in that sense, it was not problematic, but democratically in terms of sort of a role in the democratic system of governance, being accountable towards the nation in a formal way, that doesn't fit here. But it provides an important test of integrity and demand for publicity of reasons on behalf of those in power. Now, to the second condition of accountability for reasonableness, which is the one of relevance. Relevance concerns whether the reasons provided for policy decisions are relevant for the subject matter. Are they based on reliable data, reasons, and principles that can be accepted by all fair-minded people, as it is put in a document by Daniels, people who are interested in firm terms of cooperation. So this procedural idea very much in the spirit of Rawls. This condition implicitly relies on trust in experts who can assess the quality and significance of data. The fairness of decisions is thus substantially tied to expert judgment or trustworthy authority, which I think needs to be distinguished from the power aspect that I mentioned before, because I think there is of course a power in expert judgment, but if it's properly conducted, then it's a sort of a trustworthy authority that can contribute substantially to accountability for fairness. Now in COVID, at first sight, the relevance condition seems rather straightforward. The task is well defined, the threat is imminent, and the objectives are clear. This demarcates well the domain and significance of data and moral principles. The main data about distribution of infection and seriousness of disease, the aims to protect the vulnerable and the healthcare system, and the main principles, protection from harm, least infringement of liberty, solidarity, and some other could be mentioned. Now, are other data and aims also relevant, and then why? In Iceland, I think relevance is or has been interpreted through the lens of expertise. The expertise mainly of epidemiology and disease prevention, public health and safety, and biostatistics. These were very sort of prominent expert domains. Although there were also regular consultation with several groups, mostly in the fields of medicine and healthcare. The chief epidemiologist pointed out that it is the role of politicians to take other relevant matters into account. We need to look at the sort of the public health issues through the medical lenses mainly. Now, vulnerability was thus mainly interpreted through medical lenses, and the utilitarian perspective of public health, very much similar to what Reidun was just talking about. Now, criticism has been voiced by marginalized groups whose life conditions worsened substantially and disproportionately during the pandemic. The effect of strict screening policies on children and families who have very different resources. Now, is there a need to revise the ethical framework of the pandemic policies? That brings us to the last, what that I mentioned, the revision and appeals. The success of the Icelandic policy is largely due to careful contingency plans. Roles are clearly defined, so everyone knows their station and its duties when the threat arises. Again, quoting the chief epidemiologist, when you need to take 1,000 decisions each day, it is impossible to view the matter from all perspectives. Then you lose control of the epidemic itself. In preparing for future pandemics, it is desirable to include both a more diverse team of experts and members from the public to inform policymakers and influence the understanding of relevance. Example here, there were strict policies in nursing homes in the pandemic, ban on visits to inhabitants. An economic assessment of this policy has been performed. And here's a quote from a news brief from this. The numbers speak for themselves. Several lives were saved. In effect, the question is, in the spring of 2020, how high a price was people willing to pay for being able to visit their loved ones? But the inhabitants and the loved ones were not asked this question. Their first-person perspective and voices is absent in this objectivistic approach. I call it objectivistic if it's completely sort of from without. So a revised ethical framework has to have a stronger commitment to social justice, which requires relational understanding of autonomy and solidarity, which is very much like Ryden just mentioned. It's a matter of fairness to protect every citizen's interest, not just the aggregate benefit of a policy. This requires that we take the difference between individuals more explicitly into account, be more attentive to the special and systematic disadvantages of certain groups. And this calls for inclusion of members of these disadvantaged groups in contingency plans. Relevance should not be objectivistically determined, although our shared interest in survival, security, and liberty are generally clear and uncontroversial. It cannot be carried out fairly without sensitivity to the special circumstances of the least advantaged. I think this is an oversight, clearly an oversight in the contingency plans, because I think this approach that has been very successful in Iceland is, if anything, partly suffers perhaps from a partial moral blindness due to the lenses and framework used. And I leave this one out because I know time is running. And the Icelandic case has been seen as successful, but it is important to ask how we could do even better. Emphasis has been on effectiveness of measures evaluated from a narrow perspective, objectivistic aggregate benefit. It has been widely accepted, but normative legitimacy, I think people make distinction between empirical and normative legitimacy. So it has been empirically legitimate, but perhaps normative legitimacy could be improved. The accountability for reasonableness turns the focus on fairness and conditions for trustworthiness, implies taking the difference between individuals more explicitly into account and hearing their voices in evaluating the pandemic. That, I think, would strengthen the Nordic type of solidarity that we all share in. Thank you very much. Oh, I have these here. I mentioned the group that Kristin is, because I've been learning from them, and thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much. So time is running very swiftly, and we had time for a few questions, but I'm thinking maybe if it's better to just move on to our commentators now, and then we're in phase with the rest of the program, and then we'll have time with discussion with the speakers, so we could save a few of the questions for the panel when we have all the speakers here, unless anyone objects. No. So I think we'll just move on and ask our first commentator, Kristine Berre, who's a professor in medical ethics and philosophy of science at the Department of Global Public Health and Primary Care at the University here in Bergen. And our, yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. And also, thank you very much for inviting me to give this commentary. So I'm going to, let me see, I'm going to focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of bioethics. And we are bioethicists, we are concerned with fairness. And I was thinking that when I was preparing for this commentary that I really wanted to give a commentary that could provide all the representatives from the different countries with the equal opportunity to reflect upon my comments. So for that reason, I chosen this theme. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose 3 different questions. And I should also say right away that I'm going to be a little bit provocative, perhaps, because I'm going to hold up this mirror to all the bioethicists here, and I'm going to ask whether the bioethicists actually are up to the task of doing the kind of work that we might want the bioethicists to do during a pandemic. So the first question I'm going to focus on is, how has bioethical expertise influenced policymaking in the Nordic countries during the pandemic? The second question is, should the field of bioethics rethink its tasks and approaches to become more relevant? And finally, how can the field of bioethics become more relevant for practical dealing with a pandemic? So I will go through these questions step by step from my own perspective. And I will start by saying a little bit about how this influence of bioethical expertise was experienced in Norway from my perspective. I'm very happy that Reidun could really add to what I'm going to say now, because I had a little different experience with the relevance of bioethics during the pandemic. So this is a picture from the 12th of March 2020, when the Norwegian government closed down the whole the whole country for the first time since the Second World War. So that was a unique moment. And you can see here we have Camilla Stoltenberg to the left. She's the Director General of Norwegian Institute of Public Health. There we have next we have the former Health Minister Bent Høie, former Prime Minister Erna Solberg, and also the Director General of what's the name? The Directorate for Health. Yes. So these were the people who fronted the policy-making decisions during the pandemic. And one question one could ask is, where are the bioethicists? Because central to what they announced on this day was the policy that people should really be solidaric. We should make sure to protect the vulnerable in the society, and we should also make sure to protect the healthcare system so that people with needs should not experience have them unmet because of the healthcare system would be overwhelmed by sick people. So the essence of the policy was extremely ethical, you could say. So in that sense, it's from a bioethicist perspective a little bit surprising, perhaps, that we didn't see any bioethicists on the podium. And we didn't see anything to them during the next 2 years with all these more or less daily reports from the governments. Okay, so I'm again really happy that Reidun could feel in this picture a little bit with a bit more positive experiences of being in demand as a bioethicist during the pandemic. From my perspective, the most, or perhaps actually the only formal way that I have perceived bioethicists being involved in the policy making during the pandemic is related to this expert group that Reidun was a part of on ethics and priority setting. And this group was asked or assigned the task of coming up with recommendations on prioritized groups for corona vaccination. And this group got really a lot of attention both in the media, but also politically, I would say. So great work to Reidun and co there. But if you look into this, in the evaluation of how the governments actually dealt with the coronavirus, this independent coronavirus commission was established, and they have come up with a two-part report. The first part of the report was published 1 year ago, and the second was recently published now. Together it's about 900 pages. And quite interestingly, I think at least, there is no ethicist involved in the group or in the commission. If you go through the reports, there is no sections devoted to the ethical perspective, despite the nature of the policy that is super ethical, I would say. And also, we could perhaps expect that, well, an evaluation might perhaps take part according to a framework, an ethical framework. But as Katrine Holst, a professor in sociology at the University of Oslo, just pointed out, there is no discussion of the criteria for the evaluation of how the pandemic has been handled. So we could have a window there for including more ethical perspectives, but that didn't happen. Okay, so why is that the bioethicist has not been so visible, I could say, at least in Norway? So I guess perhaps what your experience, Reidun, might be related to the more clinical ethical work and what is going on in the hospitals and so on. So of course that will not, people who are not part of that have been able to have such have an insight too. But if you try to explain this conspicuous, I would say then, fact that these bioethicists were quite absent from the discussion. We could think, of course, that perhaps Norway is a little country, we don't have many of them, they're simply not visible. That could be an explanation. Another explanation could be that, well, as both Vilhelmur and Reidun also touched upon, that the whole discussion was framed very much in a biomedical discourse, which make it very difficult for ethical voices to get heard. That could also be an explanation, and perhaps a comfortable one for bioethicists. But the question I want to raise is whether bioethicists actually have been up to the task to meet the challenges of the pandemic in an adequate way. So, to say some words about that perspective, I think this is a very useful way of categorizing the different tasks that bioethicists are doing. This is John Evans, an American sociologist, who writes about how public policy and bioethics has not been a success in the United States. I'm not going into that, but I think it's very useful. He divides these tasks into 4. He says that, well, bioethicists are concerned with healthcare ethics consultation, that is what's going on in the hospitals. They are concerned with scientific and medical research on humans, which, of course, is a lot of work going into the research ethics departments. And then we have cultural bioethics, and this is defined as efforts at convincing ordinary citizens on the proper ethical course of action concerning a medical or scientific technology or practice. So this is what is going on in the journals, for instance, and in the public debates. And then lastly, we have public policy. And why might it be that bioethicists in Norway has not been able to have a visible impact on this public policy? So one thing, this is my way of thinking about it, but of course, what became very soon very clear was that we were dealing with moral dilemmas, and as a moral dilemma is not only a conflict of interest or ethical interest, it's about interests that are conflicting, but whatever you choose to do, you end up with making someone carry some burdens that people have ethical claims on that should be alleviated. So, of course, from a bioethicist's point of view, it might not be very tempting to try to work very hard to solve these conflicts that we already have defined as moral dilemmas, because we know we will not be able to come up with really, really good solutions to them. So that could be one way to explain the lack of engagement of bioethicists on the policy-making level. But another way to think about it is also to go through the very specific characteristics, I think, of the kind of issues that arise according to the pandemic. And I will just mention some of them here now. Well, first of all, it's obvious that these ethical dilemmas, they are being played out among strong political and economic interests that William just illustrated. So this, of course, then requires careful identification and protection of the ethical dimension of the policies. So you need to have someone who can stand up to protect that, and that can be quite difficult. And then we have this element of uncertainty that several already have touched upon. This fundamental uncertainty that is related to the development of a pandemic really needs to call upon people to take a coordinated overview of how to approach this process, or not the process, but the pandemic that is playing out. Yes, and it's also a question about uncertainty that changes over time. So this calls for approaches that are context sensitive and able to pick up this dynamic dimension of the virus as it's developing. Also, there is a question or a dimension of irreversibility. So if you make this kind of decision in ethical decision, you will have people carrying the burden, and those who are carrying this burden might end up being damaged in ways that cannot be undone later on. So this again calls for really preparedness in order to think about all the kind of consequences beforehand, which is of course a very, very, very challenging task to do. And also in the kind of decision making that goes into policy making, you will have to do a lot of prioritization, where you have to put weight on some alternative versus others, and this again call up on fairness, and how do we decide on fairness? Well, if it's not for some people who are appointed to do that, we usually in democratic society think that this is something that everyone should be taking part in. Also, it calls for interdisciplinarity, because in order to really understand what is at stake for people, you really need to understand their conditions for their living, etc., which calls for bioethicists to go into close collaboration with people from other disciplines than ethics itself. And yes, it calls for inclusion of stakeholders. This is something that is, of course, a matter of making the decision within a nation, but as we have already heard already today, is about the global dimension of the pandemic that really calls upon people to coordinate cooperation across borders, which also is, of course, an extremely challenging task to take on. And finally, also this point about global justice, and that we really need to take control of the pandemic in a way that really calls for global justice. So if you take all these kind of dimensions that is connected to the kind of issues that we will meet from an ethical point of view during a pandemic, I would come with the claim, it might be provocative, I don't know, that bioethicists are not trained to comprehensively address all these aspects and arrive at practical conclusions. So, sorry. So this leads to the last question: how can the field of bioethics become more relevant for practically dealing with a pandemic? And very briefly, I think that a way to approach this, and a way to prepare ethically for the next pandemic, could be to think more about the tasks of bioethicists to contribute to solving small pieces in a part of a larger puzzle, rather than think that bioethicists should be the ones who should come up with conclusions on what is a good policy or not. And this involves more empirical research in order to increase knowledge of the circumstances that create ethical conflicts and dilemmas. And this is just a quote from the Commission's work, which is not framed in in an ethical way, but they state that the pandemic has intensified social and economic differences in the population. And as a concrete example, that this is the kind of work that bioethicists perhaps should focus much more on then. So instead of pondering over how to theoretically analyze and justify the distribution of burdens and benefits, ethical preparing for a new pandemic might require better contextualized, and that's important that it have to be seen in the concrete context where they occur, contextualized understanding of suppressive and beneficial power structures that are at work during a pandemic, and also in general. Also, we are talking a lot about trust, but what is actually trust? What's a component of it? How can we really work in order to increase trust in a society? And also the phenomenon of solidarity, which is also often referred, but it's barely, or not so rarely, I should say, discussed exactly what goes into that kind of phenomena. Okay, so I leave you with these 3 questions to perhaps think about, and we hopefully can discuss it afterwards. Thank you.
So much. Yes. So we have our second commentator for the day, Kjetil Rommetveit, Associate Professor at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and the Humanities, also here at University in Bergen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak. Very happy to be here and to meet old colleagues again. So I was asked to comment on the presentation, so I have not actually prepared a presentation like Christina just did. I am more commenting on what we have heard today, and hopefully we can use this for the discussion and using it for reflecting on some of the questions that Christina just posed to us as well. I'm also not really a bioethicist, so I'm gonna. What did the sound stop? No. Okay. I'm a philosopher by background, and I also studied science and technology studies, so I'm maybe slightly more on the empirical side. But I've always been interested in the role of ethics, and also at times critical of its role in policy making and so on. So my idea was I will simply go through some of what we have heard and then try to use this as an approach to answering some of the questions of the day. How does COVID? How did it relate to ethics? How has bioethics responded to the pandemic? And what is specific also to the Nordic countries? I think we should also keep this in mind. So we started out with Matti. Well, first of all, I need to say there is a great diversity of the contributions. I will probably skip over a few finer details here. But we started out with Matti talking about the role of truth-telling in public, with examples, I think, from the Finnish context mainly. So he told us about the importance of the virtue of truth-telling for mainly aiming for politicians and decision makers, I think. So there is a theory there, some kind of communicative theory or communicative ethics of truth-telling that he is articulating and that he is using to situate in that context of communicating with the public. The next presentation was by Göran, and it was much more directed at kind of global distribution of goods, especially vaccines. And he told us about the conflict between vaccine nationalism and cosmopolitanism, right? And so how to balance these different kinds of demands and interests in a global level. So here the focus is also on decision makers. The theoretical framework may come more from political theory, also from ethics, but there is also a dint of international relations in there, I think. So quite different from the previous presentation. And then we had Catherine, who is a lawyer, a health lawyer, who told us about her projects into mapping some of the effects in the legal systems of the COVID pandemic. And here the focus was also mainly global, but also she went to the European levels and also to national levels, and very much focusing on the issue of fundamental rights as the way of assessing the impacts of the pandemic, right? So this is again a different knowledge base and a different approach to assessing the impacts of the pandemic, and it's located in the courts, right? Next out was Reidun, who was telling us about the Norwegian experience, and was also accounted for by Christina. I think the two of you can discuss between, well, maybe at dinner, who is right about the Norwegian experience. But Reidun at least very much emphasized the role of, well, actually how ethicists had been called upon by decision makers, by clinicians, for a kind of ethical decision support. And you also noticed, I think, a lack of certain perspectives, so a lack of care ethics, of virtue ethics, and perhaps the more qualitative approaches to decision making, and to, of course, biomedical ethics. Finally, there was the presentation by Vilhjálmur that was also giving us the example of Iceland, and much more centered in a kind of a framework that can also be called ethical, of course, but it's also much more related to political theory, right? So how are certain public virtues enacted in the case of the COVID pandemic in Iceland? And he gave us some criteria relating to publicness, relevance, accountability, and so on. So there is a kind of procedural account, I think, of how things went. What is mentioned by several, and I think it's important to notice, is that many of the decisions were happening outside of the field of ethicists, right? I mean, there has been a very strong imposition of a certain kind of biomedical decision-making regime, or what we used to talk about as medicalization, right? We have had medicalization thrown in our faces. That's basically what happened, especially in the first parts of the pandemic. So I think we need to keep this in mind, that, and several of you noticed this fact, that this very strong framing power of the biomedical profession in this case. I also think that there is a certain kind of tilt towards the needs of decision makers in this context. There is very much there is much talk about, you know, management of the situation, of how to communicate with the public. So actually, if I should judge by most of the presentations today, the main needs were the needs of the large institutions, following from the biomedical framing, right? I think the exception to this is Catherine's presentation, which is actually located more in the context of the vulnerable groups that are mentioned by several, but actually the courts and the human rights lawyers are the only ones, at least in this today, that we have heard, that are actually being named as specific kinds of groups. So the problems of immigrants, the problems of the mentally ill, the problems of children, the problems of women, the problems of the poor, and so on. And as several have noticed, the divisions within society and inequalities have been intensified, as was said in Christina's presentation. So it's clear that many of these groups have come out the worse, I guess. So my question then would be, what does this tell us about the kinds of knowledge that we use for evaluating and for the pandemic, and for also, you know, taking lessons into the future? I think, at least in the origins of bioethics, there was a strong alliance between fundamental rights and bioethics, and a very strong position, kind of standpoint epistemology, taking the position of these vulnerable groups. And I wonder if it would be an idea to discuss the interrelations between law and ethics in these kinds of decision-making procedures, maybe inserting law and fundamental rights as the fundamental parameters for assessing the effects on groups, individuals, populations. And then you can move on to the, the needs of decision makers and so on, which certainly are important. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's mainly what I had to say. I would also encourage us to go on discussing, just to say the cases were really diverse that have been shared with us, to discuss what is this Nordic solidarity that Wilhelm was alluding to, what lessons are here from, across the different Nordic countries, and also what is there to be learned perhaps from the ways in which Nordic countries imagine international institutions, perhaps also in a more equalitarian terms than other cultures and countries. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can all stay. Yes. So we'll conclude today with asking all our speakers back up on the stage or the floor, together with the commentators as well. And I think we can also begin, if there's questions from the audience. I think that would be a nice way to start off. And also, if there's questions from our online watchers, that would be...
Stand over there, everyone presented,
yes.
And then Madeleine and I can sort
yes.
of try to direct it from here. So let's see who's missing.
Yes, and we have a big microphone for audience.
Yeah. Catherine,
All right.
Because there weren't enough.
Yeah.
I see. So.
But that's okay. We can just carry it around from Catherine, because
Yes.
only one person can speak at a time.
Or you could.
Yeah.
Or you could have this one. I think that makes more sense. You take this one.
Hi, my name is Andrea from the Pandemic Center at the University of Bergen, and I was very thankful for what Kristin said, that what this pandemic has taught to us is that one single discipline cannot help us in handling crisis. And this is what we do at the Pandemic Center at the University of Bergen, where we work on the pandemic with an interdisciplinary approach. Which also I hope that the Norfolk perhaps in the future can continue this discussion that is not just across disciplines, but also across countries in the Nordic. My question is for the professor from Iceland, the philosopher. You spoke about trustworthy authorities, and this has been a dilemma during the pandemic. Who has the right to speak? Because then one might argue it's the doctors, but which kind of doctors? And who takes that decision that that person is trustworthy? And also, what is the role of academic knowledge during a crisis? Should academics come together? Should everyone speak for themselves? And so on. So what's the role of knowledge and academic knowledge?
Well, I think the role of academic knowledge is crucial in a pandemic, and of course, as I think was clear both from presumption in your initial statement and in what I said, academic knowledge generally. But I mentioned, I mentioned specifically trustworthy authority, because I was having in mind, I just had sort of asked the question of power. How is power exercised? And I think that is a very crucial question that needs to be, and that, for example, the decode example I had, I think is a very challenging one and a complex one. But a trustworthy authority, I think, has two aspects. It's the way people handle information, that the sort of epistemic honesty and trustworthiness, the way in which they deal with information. I think it relates a lot to what Matti was saying in the beginning, to be truth-seeking and willing to change their mind in light of new evidence and all that. That's sort of the epistemic aspect. But also, I think there is a personal. There's some fancy name for this that I can't remember. There's another kind of trustworthiness that relates more to the virtues of the persons who are presenting the evidence. That they have this kind of sincerity and honesty and öðmýkt. What is that? Humility and epistemic humility. That I think that's a key to trustworthiness. That people sort of sense that this is done in very good faith and in really in the light of best interest of the audience. So, am I leaving something out of your question? But this.
I'm listening and I'm reflecting on what you're saying, because in an era where we have an excess of communication, it felt like not if you had a certain line of thought, you were not encouraged to express your opinion during the pandemic. So it's not about being trustworthy. It's more like how in the discourse regarding the pandemic, how can we have a fora for exchanging opinions?
Well, perhaps some others might want to come in.
Yeah, this can be a question for everyone, anyone here. Anyone wants to comment?
But I think perhaps you were saying that perhaps that some people were discouraged because so there wouldn't be a multiplicity of voices. And this is a very good question that I'm not ready exactly to. I'm thinking about it. Give the word to some others now.
Yeah, Göran.
Well, related to that question, I think, is that this has been an extremely learning experience in the public discussion, that you have researchers in epidemiology and other fields that are so much in disagreement. I mean, at least in the Swedish debate, it has been obvious that we have had one view that has been proposed by the expert or the public health authority, which is kind of the expert authority and have been directing a lot of the policies, and then had come up criticism all the time from a group of epidemiologists and infection experts and so on, arguing for much stricter regulations and so on. And these different views, of course, based on different estimation of the development of the disease and so on. And after this, one can at least not say that research says that we should do this and that. I mean, it's part of research that we have with these conflicts, and we try to find the best solution. And another interesting, I think, discussion which relates to your question is, who shall direct the policy, the government or experts? And in Sweden, the expert authority, the public health authority, Folkhälsomyndigheten, has had a very active role, and the politicians and the government have very much followed their recommendation, and then got these critiques from other researchers. But in this Corona Commission, they criticized that the government has in some way stepped back and not really taken the responsibility for the decision. On the other hand, it's really problematic for a government to say something more well-grounded than the expert authority. So that's an ongoing discussion, at least in our context, in the Swedish context.
Thank you, Göran. Reidun.
Yes, I want to follow up your comment. And you said that even epidemiologists, Swedish epidemiologists, had different views. Did you have room for expressing these views? And where were the Swedish ethicists in this? Because there obviously was were a lot of value issues.
Right, so that's a little typical, I think, for the Swedish context also. It's a real trust in experts, so to say. And they could express their views and they did regularly in the daily papers. So Dagens Nyheter had a lot of articles from these people who were critical to the role of the ethicist, was your second question, has been very small, I would say, in this context. The very seldom has the ethicist or the SMER, which is this ethical National Ethical Committee, has been asked for their views on some of the policy. It was asked when it comes to children vaccination, but almost never. In the Corona Commission, there were no person no person within the commission that had an ethical background, an ethicist. So the ethicist has played a kind of minor role, I think, in influencing the policy.
Like in Norway, then.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Okay. Kjetil, and then Ingemar.
Yeah, just to add to the other replies, I mean, I think, especially if we talk about how to create a kind of public consensus or what you would call public reason, it depends very much on institutions, and really what people trust, I think, is very much institutions. So even if you talk about experts, I mean, they're also institutions. It's Public Health Institute in Sweden. It has a huge authority. In Norway, I think what you saw also was that there was a political level intervening at a certain point for certain reasons, closing down society in a way that was different from the Swedish experience. So there you had the politicians intervening, so that there was first kind of biomedical advice, and then comes the institution of politics. And you also had the lawyers, the fundamental rights lawyers and the constitutional lawyers who were quite vocal in the early stages of the pandemic, saying, I mean, there are some problems relating to fundamental rights here. So I think in a situation like that, we kind of go back to those very basic institutions that we know about and trust.
Thank you. Ingemar?
My name is Ingemar Engström. I've been on this committee for 6 years, but not any longer. I also been on the Swedish National Medical Ethics Council, and not any longer. But this conference is so interesting because we can compare experiences. And I was struck by the fact that also the Norwegian Corona Commission didn't at all talked about values or ethical issues. Like SMER did produce very early this product that you showed us about ethical points of departures. Could you say that? It was not very much used, as I understand. It was not published in media or anything. It was difficult to come through with the message. I had contact with the Anders Tegnell, our chief epidemiologist, very early in the pandemic, and asked, aren't you going to have an advisory council of ethicists? And his answer was, what use could they make? So the lesson learned today is how can we be more relevant as ethicists? But obviously we aren't, and that's a huge problem. What is the problem? Because I think one basic point of departure is that we are used to differentiate between facts and values. People in general don't do that, neither the public nor media nor politicians. So it's a matter of ethical grammar, it's a matter of ethical language, it's a matter of ethical communication. We are not very good at that. We have our academic language, which is far out. What did work in the beginning of our pandemic was that media picked up single cases that didn't get intensive care. And people were so interested in that. And around a case like that, you could have an ethical discussion. But talking about population level and policy making and what could ethics have to do with that, that's a much more difficult task to do. So it's not only their fault, it's also our fault that ethics hasn't been made enough relevant. And I have a second point. There was one exemption for that, and that was when the Public Health Authority very heavily, our Director General, what's his name now? Carlsson, Johan Carlsson. He made it very clear that our task as an authority is to look at public health in a broad way, not only COVID. We cannot lose every other aspect. So he fought, struggled with that, have the schools kept open. And being, I'm a senior editor at Acta Pediatrica, and we have had hundreds of manuscripts talking about the effects on mental health in children. I'm a child psychiatrist also, so that's dear to my heart. And it's so good to see that countries that kept the schools open have much less influence on the mental health of children. That's an ethical question that we can have empirical studies on.
Thank you, Ingeborg. I'm sure all of you would like to, because these are the key questions I think we can all agree. So first, someone who has not spoken already, Katharina, maybe if you begin.
I mean, I just wanted to say that I think it's very easy to say all the things that you don't do, and that's the reason you're excluded. But often when I look at these commissions, and I think, why were they included? I mean, if you've ever sat in anything like this, there's a lot of politics behind the scenes, and there's a lot of, oh, well, I studied with this person and that person. So, I mean, I don't think that necessarily people are objectively picked for commissions based on being the best suited. That's maybe a bit controversial to say, but I think it's not maybe necessarily something that the ethicists are doing wrong, that their voices are not being heard. It's maybe they're just like not friends. I don't know, maybe you have to join the right golf club or something. But I mean, I think that, yeah, so I mean, because often, yeah, lawyers are often sit on these things, or people with legal background, but sometimes I look at it and I think, okay, that person knows nothing about health law. Like, I mean, they know nothing about this type of law. So yes, you can know something about law, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know anything about pandemics and pandemic law. So that was all I wanted to say.
Yes, I like very much that you mentioned medicalization, because that is a word I would really raise up now. And talking about the use of ethicists, I agree with you. Ethicists could have been used in the summing up of the experiences and so on. But then I feel, in a way, a need to criticize myself too, and ethicists, because we were too obedient. Closing down schools was an issue, and prioritization of old people and healthcare personnel for vaccines. Why didn't we protect the people working with small children with vaccines so that they could be kept open? In a way, it was obvious to me, but you kind of I kind of suppressed myself. We could have gone out and said, listen, people, this is not about intensive care only. Health is a wide concept, and we should protect the vulnerable much more than we did out there. We could have done it.
Who wants to be next?
Kirsten? Well, I just briefly that I think you said I suppressed myself. I could relate to that, but I think also that I mean I think the authorities in Iceland handled the case quite well, and they I found most things done for a long most of the time sort of by the book, according to sort of public health ethics as that is generally conceived. it's more in retrospect that I totally agree with it. We have to protect the most vulnerable. I think my own conception of vulnerability just gradually changed. I learned to listen to the voices of the disabled, and which perhaps I had not. So it's a learning experience for myself as an ethicist. So I think actually, often perhaps we tend to speak out when we are critical. But when I participated in, for example, a seminar at the Medical Association yearly meeting, it was rather praising of the policies that were being done, and so I mean that's also an important contribution. I mean that we are in agreement with at least the general lines, and also I think, and that relates to your question before, that I think. The intolerance towards dissenting voices was actually mostly from the public. I think our experts were very open to critical voices, and they said we have to listen to these, and and all that. But we have our reasons, but the general public that was very compliant, and they, in a way, they found it disturbing that where there was critical voices. And that's something for us to consider, especially if we're thinking about sort of the issue of democratic participation. And perhaps this is also because the public is not used to, and I left out one PowerPoint slide where I was talking about the emphasis on participation versus institutionalization and the interplay between the two, because we need perhaps to, especially when we are in a learning process from a pandemic, to have sort of inclusionary meetings where we really bring together and create a forum for all these voices to when we at a cool hour, because we are at a cool hour now, and how long that lasts, we don't know.
Yes, so back to your question, and I think that maybe perhaps one of the shortcomings of bioethics might be that it's so much influenced by philosophers. So we continue this self-pisking, as we talk about it in Norwegian, to punish ourselves here. So maybe the fact that we are very much leaning up on the principles way to approach issues might also be a way we also constrict our perspective of what is actually ethical relevant. So when suddenly vulnerability comes up, we have not actually discussed that, and we don't have a vocabulary, we don't have the empirical data or understanding of the phenomenon that we really need. So I'm really much in favor of shifting the focus of what we're doing as bioethicists in that sense, in order to be prepared for the next pandemic.
Just some comments to this also. It's of course difficult to see the role of ethicists where exactly they should play this role. I mean, if it's we can make the principle of prioritization, of course, visible and relevant in the public discussion. We could also, I think, emphasize the importance of responsibility for decision-making, which I think has been, at least in our context, a little vague. There has made some decision which was made well against the principal priorities, for example, in some of the regions of Sweden, which said that, for example, people in elderly homes should not be sent to intensive care, which is contrary to this principle, because it must be individually decided. And where do you find this decision? That was very difficult to see who gave the decision, who gave this restriction, made these directions that go so much against the official platform, prioritizing platform. So the question of responsibility, I think, also something we should, in retrospect, lift up as an important question. Who takes responsibility for what decision, and what does that mean? How should you? What has happened, as you perhaps heard, is also that this pandemic has sort of revealed, revealed, yes, the poor condition of the elderly care in Sweden. I mean, that's really a lesson learned, exposed how this, and there is a lot of lessons learned from that, I hope, which must be then start a new policy in the future. That's I think the main problem we have had, and the number of deaths we had in a period of time, that there was a lot of problems with elderly care in elderly care units.
Yeah. So time is running short, but I'm wondering if we want to end by this great question that Kjetil mentioned toward the end, referring to Vilhelm's last word about this Nordic solidarity. That's maybe this is a unique occasion to maybe get everyone's thoughts about that. Maybe you don't have any thoughts about it, I don't know. But what is, I mean, we refer to Nordic solidarity. We have all these Nordic cooperation institutions and traditions and so on. Is this just shallow talk, or is there some substance to it? And if so, what is it, and how is it relevant to our topic today, Nordic solidarity? Yeah,
one example.
Yes.
Norway is outside the EU, and the Swedes, I read, helped us getting vaccines as if we were a member.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is maybe a good example of solidarity.
Same happened to Icelanders. Yeah. But we only recently found out. We were not told this until recently. But I think I relate Nordic solidarity very much to the healthcare systems. And so it's an institutionalized solidarity. And regardless of, we are all, I mean, it's not a service-oriented in the sense of you don't pay according to service, but in principle, anyone could need it any time. And I think when I ended with Nordic type, I think, and so we have this solidaristic idea, and we don't want to leave anyone out, but I think that's very ingrained in our mentality, or I don't know if we can generalize about the Nordic mentality, but in Iceland, I think the idea of samstaða, we are all in this together, was very much used. And it was appealed to the solidarity, and there was solidarity with the weakest. But I think what I meant, we need to deepen and strengthen the idea of Nordic solidarity by exactly identifying more clearly the vulnerable ones, the marginalized groups, and their special needs, and how they are disproportionately affected in situations like this, and how can we, in a relational spirit of ethics, strengthen their conditions, and I don't think that would affect sort of the more general approach. It's just we need to complement it with stronger awareness of these groups, and I find that very much in the spirit of Nordic solidarity.
Good answer.
Yeah, and I think also this in the Swedish situation where there was less regulation, no lockdowns, and so was built on this feelings of communality and trust, which meant that really most people, almost all people, was willing to follow this without any, didn't have to obey the lockdown. They were voluntary, living up to these restrictions, which is, I think, a sign of a society different from the American, for example. Where I don't think this would have been possible.
Yeah, trusting in people's judgment, solidarity in that sense.
Yeah, I think that
this is us, and therefore I trust in our judgment. Yeah, right.
Exactly, and that's very much how the Troika.
This is how they approached
spoke a lot.
But you remember when we went public with some criticism?
Yeah, well,
the public, I think, reacted in a way that indicated the public felt that we were breaking the solidarity by raising critical questions.
Yeah,
but I don't want to stay with I think Kristin was next.
I stayed away from
right.
So I very much agree that the welfare functioning in the societies is very important in order to support this ability to demonstrate solidarity. But it would also be interesting to explore further to what extent the fact that we actually have money that can compensate for a lot of the burdens that many people have had to carry, to what extent that also have an impact on our willingness to be solidary. We shouldn't take it for granted that it is simply goodwill.
Yeah. Kjetil?
Yeah, and just continuing on that, I think solidarity is also something to be aimed for. It's not something that we should just take as an existing fact, because it has also come out of historical struggles that we are now perhaps taking a bit as for granted. But I think in some of these cases, and there may be more pandemics or other kinds of crises, that's quite likely, we need to also think about how to reinvent solidarity in the face of crisis. Which also means you cannot, for a long, persistent time, for instance, have a purely biomedical view on how society is to be run. That is not a good thing. You need to have more voices into creating that solidarity.
Yeah, that's a very important point.
Yeah. Good note to end on.
Yes. Yeah, I will let. Were there hands up? Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. If you don't mind, we'll take. Yes. Go ahead.
I was just wondering. I'm Tuija from Aalto University, Finland. I was thinking about the Nordic solidarity that William was talking about there a few minutes ago, and the fact that basically the question is that whether the problem is that the vulnerable people became more vulnerable, was that because we were unaware of them being vulnerable and that we didn't have our solidarity, really didn't reach them because we were unaware of their existence. But I'm worried that there is a tiny different kind of a problem here as well, which might be that Nordic people are not anymore that certain who is us. I mean, we are all in this together. And it might be that the pandemic also is starting to reveal some frictions in our societies where perhaps we don't think that everyone is worthy of our solidarity. And these are these two kind of different things of the Nordic solidarity. I mean, who is us, who are we solidarity in with, and then we need to recognize if there are, that's a bigger problem in terms of who are we and what should we be. And then the other is more practical problem. We just need to know who's vulnerable so that we can help them. So I don't know whether that was more of a, if someone has an answer, please. Otherwise, that was just a comment.
Yeah, great comment. Solidarity and diversity, how do they go together, for example? Katarina.
I agree with you. When you were talking, I was thinking solidarity with whom. I don't know a lot about the other Nordic countries, but there has been an issue of racism in Denmark during the pandemic, blaming certain groups who look different, who don't speak Danish. At the start of the pandemic, all the communication was in Danish. Some people made Facebook groups to, translate it to English. I had some friends who I would text and tell them, oh, now it's illegal to do this, but otherwise people were completely lost. And people were questioning the Prime Minister and saying, maybe it's important to communicate in other languages. And she just said, well, people should just learn Danish. And you can have that as a political belief, but the problem, as everyone in this room knows, is that it doesn't matter what language you speak. You can still get COVID. You can transmit COVID. So I think, yes, there's many positive things in these Nordic welfare states, and there is this idea of solidarity to a certain extent, but I think some of the expectations of worthiness for solidarity, for example, expect that you pay taxes, so you have a job. So if you don't have a job, if you're too elderly, if you have a disability, then maybe you're not contributing. Or if you are a refugee or an asylum seeker. And this phenomenon of what's called welfare chauvinism, it's not new. I mean, it's definitely been rising since the so-called refugee crisis of 2015. So yeah, I just want to say I agree that solidarity is very nice, but we always have to think of who's included and excluded.
That has been a learning lesson, I think, also in Swedish, because it was very obvious that the minority groups were worst affected and the death toll was highest because they vaccinated less and so on. And the learning here should be that we must be more inclusive, and not least when it comes to language. It took some time, but after a while, the authorities also informed about vaccination, about COVID and restrictions in different kinds of languages that was necessary, I think. So hopefully this is something we also learned from the...
I tend to link this to what Kjetil just said, that it's dangerous to see solidarity just as something historically given in terms of traditions and values. It needs to be in continual sort of re-evaluation, and because of this necessity of, I think, of inclusion and difference, and which I think, and that I think leads to this sort of participatory approach that I talked about, which is part of this accountability for fairness, that when people meet really in a dialogue, they tend to adopt sort of a public standpoint and gain more mutual understanding of each other. And I think then differences of the kind that you just mentioned tend to diminish. And but explicitly, I think people were aware of the existence of these groups, but I think sort of their vulnerabilities were just much more clearly exposed in the pandemic.
Good. I think we're running short of time, right? So Madeleine, do you want to finish?
I'll refrain from opening a box of new questions. So I think, but there seems to be also, apart from being transparent and solidarity, there's also this sort of back door to a lot of democratic decisions, which is the consultancy. I mean, when democracy, at least Nordic democracy, when it works well, consultancy before decisions can be very, very broad, and any organized civil interest can be an organized organization that submits some kind of view. But I think some of that has been lost with fewer interests being organized, and there are a lot of interests that perhaps don't have someone to advocate, which is a different thing than just receiving information in a sort of top-down thing. So maybe we should look to the classic open door to the king and raise your voice and have an input the other way. That was a thought, but that's a massive topic. I just like to thank you everyone for your fantastic contributions today, and I hope we'll see you all tomorrow. We have a full program from 9 o'clock tomorrow, and we'll hear a bit about the policymakers' viewpoint and also the stakeholder, particularly from the interest of the elderly and the youth perspective tomorrow as well. So thank you very much for your participation, and a big round of applause, I think, would be...